It's that time once again. We are creeping up on the start of a brand new season of Revolution Custom Standard as we bid farewell to Cliques of Nylon and say hello to Stirrings in Goldport. Designed by community member Catalyst, it's got quite a lot of spicy mechanics to talk about, and it looks to be doing quite a lot to shake up the format alongside the departure of Nylon. I think about 200 cards, roughly, a little over 200 to talk about today. So with a lot of ground to cover, we're going to hop right in. As always, links to the Custom Magic Discord server and all of the relevant resources are in the description below, including links to the LackeyBot and Escape from Limbo search engines tuned to show you all the new cards from this set. As always, we'll start with mechanics, then new lands, and then break things down in color order, but with a twist compared to our usual format. Stirrings in Goldport has a Colorless Matters theme that we'll be discussing in a moment, so with that being the case, we're going to move to cover the colorless cards after the lands rather than at the very end. Some final things to note before we begin. Every design we see here is subject to change, as the curators and designers pick out cards that may need adjusting between the submission period and rotation. Additionally, you all may need to bear with me here. This is a crazy daunting task I have ahead of myself. As remains the case, I don't have an editing software that I can run on my computer without causing some issues, so this video is recorded all in one take. I may have some verbal flubs, I may stumble over my script, I may go off script. I'll do what I can with the intense amount of card discussion we have ahead of us to make sure everything is easily navigatable. I think I usually say navigable. My brain just decided that was wrong this time. As evidenced, with timestamps for every section. I have to put a break between the blue and black cards rather than the black and red like usual for my own well-being, so please bear with me as I work my way through. I just realized I say bear with me twice in this script. Obviously going off course already. We're doing great. Bear with me as I work my way through the full card catalog we have to cover today. So without further ado, let's dive into the review. The big mechanical aspect of Stirrings of Goldport that may be familiar to longtime players is the presence of the Devoid mechanic. We're starting strong, folks. And a focus on colorless mana costs. There are 14 cards that check for you to spend colorless mana to cast them or activate their abilities, plus an additional 19 cards that require colorless mana to cast. This is supported by 16 different cards that create the 1/1 Eldrazi Scion token that sacrifices colorless mana, alongside 17 Devoid cards that provide additional tools and support to Colorless Matters themes. This is a foundationally important part of the set's structure, hence why we'll be covering colorless cards so much earlier in the review than usual. Devoid and Colorless Matters costs appear across all 5 colors, though Scions are primarily created in black and green and colorless, with a couple exceptions scattered here and there. However, we will still have some colorless cards to talk about in each of the colors sections, courtesy of the new Mythos mechanic. Mythos functions somewhat similarly to Adventure, a mechanic we're all pretty familiar with by this point, blended with a bit of Channel and Prepared. A Mythos spell is one you can either cast from your hand or cast a copy of it from the battlefield once. If cast from your hand, you put it into your graveyard as it resolves like you would any other instant or sorcery. If you cast from the battlefield, again, you can only do so once while the creature attached to it is in play, and the creature just stays in play. It's just a copy of the Mythos spell. This status does reset if the creature leaves and then is returned to play, so it functions much more like a prepared spell for creatures that only prepare upon entering, as you might be familiar with from Secrets of Strixhaven, released earlier this year in Official Magic. There are 18 creature cards with Mythos spells, but only 3 that aren't colorless creatures, and only 2 colorless creatures whose Mythos spells don't require a color of mana to use, meaning there's a good deal of flexibility among the suite. Mythos appears across all 5 colors, and will cover each color's colorless Mythos cards as they prove relevant in their respective sections. Colorless mana isn't the only returning mechanic in Stirrings in Goldport. And much like it, this one is also both a canon mechanic and one we've seen in a previous Revolution set. Investigate is making its sparkling return to Revolution for the first time since Secrets of the River Cities rotated. You know, the second set to ever rotate out of Revolution. For the uninitiated, Investigate is an action word that causes you to create a clue artifact token, which can be sacrificed for 2 mana to draw a card. We already have a relatively clear idea of how reliably you can expect to spend mana on clues, as I made the comparison to clues when assessing chart tokens in Solastira at the turn of the year. So Investigate shouldn't have too much issue offering some clear card draw opportunities. There are 19 cards that investigate, plus 2 cards that care about having clues in play, and a card that turns something into a clue. Investigate is near exclusively used in blue and green, with the singular exception of a black mythic creature. Perhaps the biggest swing of Goldport's mechanics, and probably my favorite of the bunch, is Fragment. Fragment's another token-creating action, this time one that's done to creatures. To fragment a creature, you create a 1/1 token copy of it and put a splinter counter on both, with the catch that creatures with splinter counters on them can't become fragmented. This does mean that if you blink a fragmented non-token creature, or make further token copies of a fragmented 1/1 creature, you'll be able to fragment those creatures again, opening the doors for prolonged value lines, provided you can line it all up. Fragment is used in all 5 colors, as well as colorless, with 11 creatures that can fragment themselves and 10 cards that can fragment your creatures generally. Up next, we have The Void Calls You. Cards with this mechanic care about things going to your graveyard during your turn from either your library or hand. So long as you've had a card go to your bin from either of those 2 zones, the Void has called you in your turn, meaning that while sacrifice effects won't care, self-mill, surveil, and discard all will. This is used in a few ways, toggling on effects of certain cards while the Void has called you in the turn, serving as a condition to be met on a trigger, and even being used as a trigger condition in its own right. There are 20 cards that check for the Void calling you, exclusively across blue, black, and red. Lastly, we have Coalition. This is an ability word noting a triggered ability that goes off when the attached creature attacks alongside one or more creature tokens. Between Eldrazi Scions, Fragment, and several other kinds of creature tokens that pop up in the set file, Goldport may be a Colorless Matters set, but Token Matters is arguably its other strongest theme. Coalition is found on 9 creature cards, almost exclusively in green and white, with the exception of a green-blue mythic. Kicking off the proper review with lands, we've got 2 cycles of Enters tapped lands that help you to fix the colorless mana in your decks if you want to. We will bookend this section with those 2 cycles, starting with the rare cycle and ending with the common cycle. This rare cycle are monocolored lands with a utility sacrifice mode that leaves behind a nowhere land token that taps for colorless. Spindly Nexus, White's rare land, can be tapped and sacrificed for 4 and a white mana to create a tapped 4/4 colorless Eldrazi Angel with flying alongside the lands token. This ability being instant speed makes it a perfectly solid inclusion for white-based control decks, so I suspect it'll see some use here and there in those contexts. But let's get a little funky here for a moment. This Nowhere Lands token benefits the few token copying effects we've had around from Kitsuo and Twiltree. Now, that might sound like a bad equation for this effective 6-mana investment to activate this, especially since that's pretty late to be trying to ramp additional lands into play. But the rest of the cycle costs 3 mana to tap and sacrifice them and make the Nowhere land, so the rest of the cycle is far more friendly to such a strategy. For instance, Submerged Citadel taps and sacrifices to draw you 2 cards and then have you discard a card. Like with the Angel token from Spindly Nexus, the sacrifice effect here is just generically good for slower strategies, offering you some card selection and advantage by way of just, filtering out unimportant cards from your hand and getting 2 new ones in there. It's better if you have things you actively care about discarding, but it's probably too slow for a deck that's all in on having stuff to discard like Reanimators, so I think it's once again something that's best inclined towards control play. Stark Mausoleum is up next, costing 2 and a black to tap and sacrifice to return a creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to play tapped. Now, we've seen how good Unearth effects can be in Revolution, and we've got quite a few kicking around in the format already, but the big trouble with most of them comes down to opportunity cost. Including a small reanimation spell comes with the deck building complication that they're only really good when you can line them up, inevitably bending your deck towards solely focusing on this plan, or at least primarily focusing. We've seen this being the case in the past, where I got a lot of success with March of the Long Night this past January, specifically by way of playing it in a low-curve, graveyard-oriented aggressive deck, where all of its components could be relevant as often as possible. Stark Mausoleum asks none of those requirements, just that you might have smaller creatures that might eventually go to the graveyard and which you might be willing to try and get back. The comparatively low deck building cost on Mausoleum makes it a far more appealing mid-range or control tool, whether you're getting back a value-oriented creature, an interactive one, or just any lower cost creature that you might find yourself comparing or find yourself caring about in grindier strategies. This might be one of the biggest beneficiaries of this cycle, sacrificing at instant speed as well, because the mana cost makes it easy enough to weave into the place of instant speed interaction without having to hold a bunch of mana up. Our red member of the cycle might sneakily be the best of the bunch, even more so than white, blue, or black, despite those all being good lands. Smoldering Totems sacrifices to copy the next instant or sorcery spell you cast in the turn. And while my mind initially went to combo spellslinger-oriented nonsense, the mana investment here helps me come to a different conclusion. Everything I said about the Mausoleum benefiting from a low opportunity cost is amplified here, because slower decks are already liable to be running spells they care about copying, interaction, and card draw. Getting to hide a quote-unquote extra copy of one of your best instants or sorceries in your mana base at the cost of running a couple tap lands is a pretty stellar equation in my eyes for any control deck. And considering some of the best instants and sorceries that come to mind for Smoldering Totems are from Solitaire, this suite gets to have 4 seasons to see some experimentation alongside Lunar Awe, Chart the Cosmos, and company. Last of the rare cycle is Shambling Isle, which sacrifices to give a creature you control 2 +1/+1 counters and trample for the turn. This is a decently solid tool for green stompy decks, which I do think are getting quite a good suite of pickups from SGP overall. So if you think those you can risk having the occasional tap land in those decks, this could be a nice onboard trick for some extra damage or combat math shenanigans. This is also the point where I'll point out that Laybound Ritualist might really appreciate how many tap lands are in this set, because this just helps mitigate the drawback of just about every single fixing land in SGP, since the whole lot of them enter tapped, mostly even beyond this rare cycle. If you care about colorless, you might want to care about green just enough as to get Laybound Ritualist into the mix. We've got a couple more utility lands to touch on, both colorless only, before we talk about proper mana fixing. What Remains of Frosthold joins the ranks of the format's creature lands as a colorless land that can be animated to become a 4/4 Eldrazi land for 5 mana. Land creature for 5 mana. It's only until end of turn, though, which means that it's kind of awkward compared to its competition in slot. It's bigger than Rumbling Door, but lacks the vigilance that gains and requires mana input every time rather than only once. It's got more similarity with Chasm of the Silent Covenant, which is one of the more heavily played creature lands as of right now, but again, it costs one more mana to activate compared to Chasm, and I think it just, not having any relevant color fixing outside of colorless, not having any keywords, it just lands as being a little awkward overall. I think my hopes just aren't high for this one. I'm only slightly more in favor of Hall of Innovation, but there is some favor there. It can tap for colorless or be tapped by spending 2 mana to make an artifact creature you control unblockable for a turn. We don't have a deep pool of existing artifact creatures that care to get in for combat damage, but Goldport does have a red-white artifact creatures theme with some very enticing constructed tools, so maybe it's worth playing a copy or two of Hall of Innovation there. Reality Cusp is our first dedicated mana-fixing land in the set, but it shares a lot more similarities with the rare cycle than anything else because its primary function is to help monocolor and 2-color decks fix for colorless mana. You have the option to choose a color as it enters, entering tapped and gaining you 1 life if you do so. From there, it taps for colorless mana or 1 mana of the chosen color, solely producing colorless if you opted to get it into play untapped. It has the most in common with one of the most overall undervalued land cycles in Magic, both custom and canon, which are the life gain duels that were originally printed in Khans of Tarkir. Tranquil Cove and company don't give you the choice to have them untapped, so in that way, Reality Cusp is a lot less awkward for your curve. But the choice can be a detrimental one in some scenarios, so while it's a valuable colorless fixing option to have in your toolbox, it might be a touch awkward here and there. Promising Vista, however, is far more exciting. It joins the ranks of Primal Fisher, Forgotten Foundation, and the Shimmering Lakefront cycle of REV's upgraded Evolving Wilds options, replacing the outgoing cityscape in the process. Vista has the most in common with Forgotten Foundation, always entering tapped and searching up an untapped basic land. However, there's one feature of Vista that brings it closer to the best basic fetch Revolution's ever had. When Promising Vista enters, you're offered the option to pay 2 life in order to add a colorless mana, thus ensuring that this basic fetch never disrupts your ability to curve out so long as the colorless mana doesn't mess with the colored mana costs you are required to pay for the turn. In this sense, it's evocative of New Divide from Bloodlike Rivers, which is, again, by far one of the best lands we've had in Revolution and a staple of both Eternal and Pauper Eternal play when they come around. While it does have one visible shortcoming compared to New Divide in not casting colored 1-drops on turn 1, it has so many benefits that are still worthwhile, and even one upside compared to New Divide, in that having an effect like Laybound Ritualist in play to let Vista come in untapped makes this generate 1 extra mana on top of your usual mana generation. I do think Promising Vista will be one of the single most format-defining cards coming out of Stirrings and Goldport, but it is so incredibly far from being the only card in the set to have an impact on REV's texture. We'll close out the lands, like I said, by talking about the other cycle, though this one's probably less notable for Constructed. Keeper's Peninsula and Company are enters tapped dual lands that tap for one of their 2 colors or colorless mana, so they support 2-color colorless decks. They're kind of just 3-color lands that enter tapped for 2-color strategies that want to make colorless mana cost requirements. I don't think they'll be especially playable, but I did want to take this opportunity before we move on from this section to at least cover some of the other colorless fixing options we have in the format, since they'll be relevant as we move forward. For proper mana fixing, the best option we've got is probably Gilded Court, since you can spend off turns having it pick up the basic land types you need outside of colorless mana, which should help make your spells far more reliable overall. Jubilant Docks is the only bounce land we have that generates colorless right now, but some of the best spells in the set that care about colorless mana are 2 mana and call out both colorless and colored mana, so that could prove useful. Protean Bows is sort of like the inverse of Reality Cusp in only making colored mana in the short term rather than the long term, but also has useful utility ability later into the game. The Volwood has probably the most synergy with the colorless themes in Goldport, as most of the colorless cost creatures have Mythos spells that you can use Volwood's second ability to fix for. Lastly, a lot of those aforementioned creatures are Eldrazi, so if you find yourself wanting a mix of colorless cost and devoid Eldrazi in your deck, Secluded Courtyard could help bridge the gap and cast both sets of creatures. As for utility lands to look at for colorless decks, there are a handful of solid options. Tomb of the Founder offers late-game value if you can either make enough mana to cast the Hidden Away spell, or if you've got enough legendary creatures and planeswalkers to reduce it down. Which is where I'll note that there are a pair of white-blue legends in the set that might help that plan come together between a creature and a planeswalker. And I'll also note that we're about to break our mana curve rule for colorless cards in a moment to highlight 3 absolutely spectacular mana cheat targets for Tomb of the Founder to hide away. The Shrouded Seas is probably the least important of this bunch, but can still do some great things when in multiples or when you have ways to sacrifice and rebuy it from your graveyard. Crumbling Ruins are de facto best non-basic land hate, and while its ability is a drawback when you need colorless mana, that could also be a boon for shutting off an opponent's only colorless mana source. Abandoned Memorial is just good graveyard recursion into the deeper turns of the game, and can be mana fixing in a pinch. And lastly, Withered Waygate lets you hide a 1 toughness removal spell in your mana base, which could be nice into board-centric matchups, or possibly even a useful tool against aggro. There are more colorless generating lands I'm skipping over here, and I highly recommend you dig through the options yourself if Goldport's colorless themes sound enticing to you. If you hadn't yet surmised by the discussion around colorless mana and Eldrazi, the plane of Caloran, where Stirrings in Goldport is set, is under siege by some of the most iconic literal big bads of classic Magic the Gathering. All 3 Eldrazi titans have converged to lay waste to Caloran, and we're getting cards for all 3 of them in this set. So how could I not break a rule here and start with the biggest colorless spells at the front of the section? Ulamog, the Earth Engulfed, is first up on our list. He's a 10/10 for 11 mana with Indestructible, granting all of your Eldrazi Annihilator 1, and exiling up to 7 cards of your choice from the opponent's library whenever he attacks. Despite all this flashy text, I think he's probably the most tame of the Titans as far as cheat targets are concerned. He lends himself best to go wide Eldrazi Kindred, where the Mass Annihilator granting effect is most likely to end the game outright without him even needing to swing in himself. There are some solid cheap Eldrazi creatures and Scion token makers kicking around that we'll talk about throughout the review, and the Scions do help with getting Ulamog down quickly, but each Scion you sacrifice to cast Ulamog does hinder how many Annihilator triggers you can get, so that might just wind up lining up pretty awkwardly. Much more unquestioningly potent, Kozilek the Bonds Unmade is a 12/12 for 12 with a ward cost, requiring the opponent to discard 2 cards. He sets your maximum hand size to 12 while he's in play, and whenever you cast him or he attacks, he draws you 5 cards and generates 5 colorless mana that persists through steps and phases for the turn. If anything in Revolution could possibly break the Valir quote-unquote blink effects that I put into the format, this is undoubtedly the candidate to make me look like a fool, as Jump the Gap represents a 2-mana draw 5 that also generates 5 colorless mana for continued value later on, and does the same at 4 mana. And I didn't mention what does the same. Soul Cage does the same at 4 mana. With both of these existing and the 2 colors pointed towards caring about colorless the most in Goldport, and the fact that these work with any other creatures that help get us more mana or Scions on cast or enter, there is quite a lot to like about this package. One last word of warning, we will not be seeing this card properly until all the way at the end with the multicolor section, but just keep in mind that there's a certain 2-mana Eldrazi named in Kozilek's honor, which might take this package beyond insane. Last, but certainly not least among the Eldrazi Titans, we have Emrakul, our first returning Eldrazi Titan in all this calamity, and our second card for her just this year. Unlike her previous appearance as the Visage of Gore in Innistrad Witching Hour, this time she is the Sky Sundered, a 14-mana 14/14 that exiles each of your opponent's hands and allows you to cast a spell from among those cards for free. From there, she's got Flying and Trample, as well as Hexproof, provided your opponent has 1 or fewer cards in hand. This is an utterly backbreaking effect, as the Hexproof guarantees that unless your opponent's packing a board wipe or an edict on top of their library, they're not going to be able to do away with her on their next turn once she's staring them down. I think Kozilek is more liable to cause proper trouble, but I think Emrakul might be the single most potent one to cheat in for just shutting the door on the opponent. Now, moving in proper mana value order like usual, let's start off with our 1-drops. And talking about colorless cards doesn't just mean talking about Eldrazi. Corrupted Hedron is a 1-mana clue with the expected sacrifice to draw ability, plus a 7 and a colorless ability to instead crack it for a 10/10 Eldrazi token. The creature token mode here is going to be very scarcely useful, so the question is really just whether or not we're so desperate for an egg that we're willing to pay 1 mana for 1 with no text besides being a clue. I think the answer is just no, at least for now. We do have a 0 mana version of that effect in Unmarked Headstones, and I don't think you ever reach for Corrupted Hedron first. But if we wind up wanting a mass quantity of cheap artifacts that can sacrifice to draw, having more is always nice. Similarly, Fate Blur Cloak is rather low impact for now, but could have some nice utility in the right contexts. It's a 1-mana equipment that equips for 2 and checks for a creature being either colorless or having 1 or more colors, making it unblockable by creatures of the opposite quality. We have a good number of equipment tokens flying around, but little in the way of full-on Equipment Matters synergies outside of Nullblade Artisan. If we wind up with more reasons to care about equipment, this could be a nice one-of option in a Nullblade Artisan package, if you're really struggling to attack through colorless decks. But I doubt it will be enough to make that suite worthwhile on its own. Goldport's bringing us a pretty monumental hate bear in Thought Scraper, a 2-mana 2/2 Eldrazi that has you choose a card name and disable all triggered abilities from sources with that name. There are plenty of enter-trigger value tools that and removal pieces and what have you, that this can just completely shut off. Considering some of her most played cards at the moment, like Shigani Manor Burns, Exorcist of Errors, Fabricated Anomaly, Sanctum of Repression, Cash Thrasher, a lot of these cards lean heavily on triggered abilities to do the bulk of their work, and Thought Scraper just stops it single-handedly. It's even a preemptive safety valve for the Eldrazi Titans, funnily enough, because you can, for instance, name Kozilek the Bonds Unmade and disable that card draw and mana generation. And its ward cost. There's one interaction that does catch my attention beyond all of that, and if it's not obvious by them being the cards I've kept on the screen this whole time, it's the interaction that has me thinking about main deck potential. This is now the third rotation, completing the trifecta started at the top of the year for scamming out bounce lands. Between Solistair giving us more bounce lands to work with, and Innistrad Witching Hour giving us one scam option in Devilthorn Hunter. If there are big idiots with awful drawback triggers to disable with Thoughtscraper as well, they aren't coming to me right now, but there's just so much to like about what the rest of this card has to offer that I have to imagine it starts popping up a lot as the format coalesces. Lantha's Journal is a 2-mana legendary book with a pair of 1-mana tap abilities, either letting you loot or put a page counter on it. Letting you loot and put a page counter on it, or remove X page counters from it to exile a card with that mana value from your graveyard and free cast a copy, the latter only being able to be done at sorcery speed. The simple, sweet control piece for any shell with reason to care about its graveyard, and that second ability seems pretty trivial to get to the point of reusing cantrips or removal spells. There's one possibility for it to see weird use in rotation, which is as a piece for a Sakura Dance shell as a repeatable discard outlet, but costing mana to activate does put a real damper in that particular interaction's overall speed, to the point where you might just as well run Fabricated Anomaly. It does also do the mana value cheating trick as seen with Tybalt's Trickery in Canon play, allowing you to cheat the cost on the backface of a modal DFC or the cost of an adventure spell on a very cheap front face. Oh, geez, I just spilled a bunch of water. I need to pause the recording real quick. All right, fingers crossed that is all taken care of. I am almost half an hour deep into this recording. I am not restarting. I had to fully pull my laptop away from my desk. Thank goodness it's a laptop on a raised stand. That could have been so much more devastating. But I did have to go through all of the paper towels I currently have in my apartment, and then also a dish towel to properly dry all of that up. And thank goodness I had so little water left in my cup. I'm going to be keeping that firmly much further away from my hands, so I don't, in an effort for my hands to have something to do to stim, accidentally knock it over again. Anyways, sorry for that little hiccup as we talk about cheating out a blue spell called Blessing of the Sea. Very prescient card to be talking about as we deal with water issues and potential water damage to my computer. But anyways, in Eternal, you can use Lantha's Journal to cheat out Blessing of the Sea as long as Journal has one page counter on it and Callaphy the Mariner is in your graveyard. So, like, if your deck is packed with cheap cantrips and interaction, Blessing of the Sea does get to just play almost every single card in your deck immediately. If you have, like, one other blue permanent in play that's just got one blue mana symbol in its casting cost, that's a Devotion of 3, and any 3-mana card or less that's blue in your deck gets to be cast at that point. The thing keeping this interaction from looking especially terrifying to me is that Lantha's Journal still needs a page counter in order to do this, meaning that the absolute fastest you could get Lantha's Journal to free cast Blessing of the Sea is turn 3, and that is provided that you, on turn 1, play either Dawnglade Cultivator or Huskforger Acolyte, and on turn 2, cast the Journal and loot, and either loot away Callaphy then, or have a way besides the Journal to loot Callaphy away on the following turn for only 2 mana while having a third land at that point to, still activate the Journal if you need both 2 mana to loot away the Callaphy. We'll see if this causes trouble in Eternal, but I'm actually not sold on it doing so. Moonstone Splinter is a bit innocuous, but might be the real deal. It's a colorless 2-mana rock, tapping for either a colorless mana or 1 mana of any color, though that colored mana can only be spent on Mythos spells. Now, the second ability obviously only matters when you're running creatures with Mythos spells, and there certainly are some good ones we'll cover throughout the review, but that's not the reason I'm hanging on this card. This is our only truly reliable colorless mana rock at 2 mana. The Founder's Cage fixes colored mana, but it enters tapped, it's rough in multiples, and has a built-in expiration date unless you can get a Planeswalker into play to feed it instead. Wolffang Talisman solves the entering tapped dilemma, but it's only useful for creature spells, meaning if there's a 4-drop you're really looking to play on turn 3, you really only have creatures to look to. Splinter is far more reliable as an option overall, and I think if you want to get ahead on mana outside of green, it's a very real piece to consider. Sorry, distracted by things. Blinding Aperture is a funky one. It's a 2-mana equipment that equips for 2, fragments the equipped creature whenever it attacks, and causes other creatures you control with the same name. I'm realizing it says of tokens, not just of that you control. Causes the abilities of other tokens with the same name as the equipped creature to trigger an additional time. It's maybe the most likely equipment I can think of for pointing to some sort of equipment shell as far as like a weird build around piece is concerned, but I don't think I'm optimistic for how little this impacts the board given the mana required to make it work. You can find it off of Contest Coordinator, put it on the Coordinator, and get 2 more cards to your hand when you swing with the Coordinator, but that's 4 mana to blink the Coordinator twice, which risks it in combat at the same time. I don't know. There's some real value on offer here, but I'm a little hesitant. Reality Wanes is tame overall, and it's definitely not an unfamiliar concept. It's a 2-mana sorcery that tutors up a basic land to your hand, and if it's a waste, you get to drain your opponent for 1 life. The only reason this registers for me is because of the cost reducers we have right now. Stormbrewer and Alchemist and Undergrowth Steward can both reduce this, and if you get 2 of those effects into play, a spell that costs nothing to get a land drop certainly looks a lot better. It's hard to say that that's actually worth it, but considering it also puts a land into your hand to loot away with other effects, which could get to Undergrowth Steward's Ancient Condition faster, it could be food for thought. Nook Dagger is pretty unremarkable overall. It's a 2-mana +1/+1 equipment that equips for 1, but it does free equip when it enters, and notably it gives that creature Death Touch for the turn. I doubt it'll matter for much overall, but it does mean that Colorless has a way to grant creatures Death Touch if those creatures can meaningfully deal damage without having to go to combat. The only particularly splashy use case I can think of right now is somehow getting it onto Ashmouth Intruders and then sacrificing the devil for a 1-sided board wipe, but I think that's maybe a little too gimmicky to move the needle on either of these cards. Titan's Effigy is a simple 3-drop, a 2/2 Eldrazi that creates a 1/1 Scion when you cast it, and it has the only generic cost mythos in Realm Break, a sorcery that creates a 10/10 Eldrazi token for 8 mana. In my head, it's not impossible to just liken this to a 3-mana creature that makes a treasure on enter, because if you reach for it, that Scion is likely to be at the heart of why you're playing it. That being said, I'm not sure it's worth the Scion for 3 mana. The best I can say is that Realm Break is a nice worst-case scenario mana outlet if you're trying to go big, so it's not an embarrassing card, since it also is 3/3 worth of stats across 2 bodies, but I don't know. I feel like it's kind of a role filler more than a deck-defining card by all measures. Rend is up next. It's 2 and a colorless for an instant that fragments a creature you control. This can be best envisioned as equivalent to a colorless blink spell, which is only really notable for Pauper applications. I mentioned in my Pauper set streams, which are archived on the channel under the live tab if you want to watch, that Cast Reflection felt like one of the truly interesting reasons to explore playing colorless in Pauper. And now Rend only compounds that equation, as colorless is the de facto clothing color of Pauper Eternal, I guess. With Pauper's variant season wrapping up this month, it's hard to say when we'll ever visit the format again in the future, so it's just a card to keep in mind for then, but I mean, I did start to figure out what to copy with Cast Reflection towards the end of the season. We have a creature named Zaptoady that makes a gold token for each creature you control named Zaptoady when it enters, and that's pretty good with blink spells, especially when you can copy up the Zaptoadies beforehand. Something worth considering. Eternity Takes is 2 and a colorless for an instant with an additional cost to cast, requiring you to either pay 2 additional mana or behold a creature with 7 or greater mana value, all just to exile a non-land permanent. This is a definite case of Solistair to the rescue for me, because all of the adventure creatures from that set are at least 7 mana, meaning that having any of them in play or in your hand meet the additional cost requirement here. For some decks, that won't really matter because white in particular is good enough at checking permanent types so as to not need this, and green only really struggles with non-flying creatures at this point. Where I like Eternity Takes is in slower red and black decks, where certain permanent types can be more difficult to deal with. It probably won't be enough to pull those decks into making room for colorless sources on its own, but it's an interesting part of the conversation. Ulamog's Augur is a pretty curious interactive 4-drop, casting for 3 and a colorless as a 3/3 Eldrazi that picks an opponent on cast, exiling both the top card of their deck and up to 1 non-land permanent they control, allowing them to return any 1 exiled card they own to their hand when it leaves play, regardless of what it was exiled by the Augur. This, ironically, is worst with Ulamog himself, because his attack trigger getting rid of the best cards in your opponent's deck would become a liability with Augur. If anything, I feel like this card just struggles to fully hook me because of that leaves the battlefield trigger. It's too prone to accidentally give your opponent a very, very powerful card, and we have some very powerful cards that sort of self-filter themselves out from being constantly replayed by exiling themselves. So Ulamog's Augur letting them get back, say, another copy of Last Wish, that's maybe a notch too far. Burgeoning Amalgam is a 5-mana 5/5 with Trample, and no colorless mana requirements, so you think, until you get to its first ability, in that it enters with a Doom counter on it for each colorless mana spent to cast it. Whenever it attacks or becomes a target of a spell, you can remove a Doom counter from it, giving each opponent the choice to exile a card from their hand or let you draw a card. It's almost incredibly exciting, and I suppose at its floor it's 2-for-1 in the face of targeted removal, as long as you spent 1 colorless to cast it. But the one thing holding it back for me is the choice being given to the opponent. There are interesting ideas floating around in my head about this with 1-mana targeted cantrips, allowing you to either shred your opponent's hand or rip through your deck, but that does fizzle out quickly because it's limited by the number of Doom counters on it. I think it's fine as a 5-drop. I'm just not sure if fine is where this wants to be. Children of the Heralds is one of the most value-oriented of the non-legendary Eldrazi, a 5 and a colorless 3/3 Eldrazi cleric that triggers whenever you cast it or another colorless spell, so long as they weren't cast by this trigger, allowing you to free cast a cheaper colorless spell from your hand. It also has a massive coat of arms style Anthem effect, giving all of your Eldrazi +1/+1 for each other Eldrazi you control, including itself. It's about as high up the curve as I think Eldrazi Kindred could reasonably anticipate reaching for reliably in constructed play, but there are some sweet things to cheat in. For the obvious, any 5-mana colorless spell, of which there are only really a few playable options, but yeah, you could slip in Zuhan's Lotus and turn Children of the Herald promptly around into a 7-drop, I guess? You can also free cast any Devoid spells, thanks to them, being colorless. The most appealing options to me are 2 possible avenues. Just, play reasonable cards, like Thought Scraper, Golden Bloom of the Silenced, Astral Displacer, Atomic Core, or go gimmicky. Protean Golem and Karina Substitute can both copy the children to yield more triggers, though neither of them get the cast this spell trigger. They will be colorless spells to trigger the Children of the Heralds. And if you copy the children, that's multiple free cast triggers and multiple anthems, and it starts to spiral out of control into an utterly colossal board. You just might need some targets beyond just the children for your Protean Golem and Karina Substitute to copy, because you only get 4 copies of this 6-drop. Bear Witness is a really weird build around mass blink spell, effectively. It's 6 mana to fragment all of your creatures as a sorcery. A pretty simple effect, and one that probably isn't that big of a deal in white, but in green, in black, in red, those are colors that don't really get a card like this that just gets to reuse all of the enter triggers they currently have in play. So there's room for some really weird interactions here. Anything that makes mana or generates value, either persistently or on enter, will assuredly make this feel more worth the trouble, and if you have any token synergies, like token doublers, this could absolutely go crazy. If you have cost reducers in play, this gets to double up how much your cost reduction is being applied, so you can take, two different, instant sorcery cost one less effect to amplify that up to 4 mana reduction. Although in that case, I think you only get so far at the end of the day. But yeah, this is a very interesting build around for value-oriented creature decks, and I'm very curious to see if it gets to do anything. Living Apogee is a 7-mana 7/7 that allows you to pay 7 mana to cast your spells rather than pay their normal casting costs. This is going to probably just wind up being exceedingly clunky in rotation, but there is a secret weapon that's just heading out the door, but we'll be thrilled to have this in Eternal. Bulk Bioengineering is one of the biggest combo engine pieces of Cliques of Nylon that just never got to fully come together. It got 4 seasons with Awakening and Uldun, which had the Wander mechanic to really capitalize on the repeatability of bioengineering's cost reduction value. But in those 4 seasons, it only got about as far as some trialing of the Audacious Rough Rider combo build. After Uldun's rotation at the top of the year, Bulk Bio fell off the map entirely, and just as it's getting a golden piece, it's leaving the format itself. But that's what Eternal play is for. In Eternal, Living Apogee represents all of your creature spells being entirely free with a Bulk Bio in play, because those 7 mana spells will cost exactly 7 less to cast. This also lifts the bottleneck previously found with Wander creatures in Bulk Bio combo, where you needed to consistently make colored mana, in order to keep wandering your creatures. If my understanding is correct, you should be able to use Apogee's cost setting for Wander costs as well, allowing you to endlessly loop any and all Wander creatures until you find one that ends the game. If that Wander interaction is correct, this seems like a definite pairing to look out for in future Eternal events, and even if not, this opens the door for a whole new way to build Bulk Bio that seems very enticing overall. Supreme Desecrator is a 9-mana 9/9 with Trample that gives your opponent's lands the ability to generate colorless mana. But it also deals 3 to them whenever they tap each of those lands for non-colorless mana. Between that mana disrupting ability and the inherent trample, this is a tangible clock to games when it comes down, but it's hard to see where it could feasibly come down considering its only advantage over the Titans in terms of reanimation is that reanimating the Titans skips cast triggers. If you do put this into play, your opponent only gets so many more colored mana symbols they can afford to pay, so you've just got to hope they don't have enough to stabilize from where they're at. Emrakul's Conscriptor has a similar issue in that it's hard to imagine wanting to free cast this rather than one of the Titans, but it does have some power on offer. It's a 10/10 for 10 with Trample and Annihilator 2, which gets to reanimate a creature card from your graveyard on cast, making that reanimated creature a 10/10 with Trample and Annihilator 2 as well. It's a lot of sudden stats, and if you can free cast this, then any odd idiot in your graveyard could be eligible to do some great work and demand removal. I could imagine it maybe seeing use in a Sakura Dance shell, where the discarding you do leading up to Dance incidentally both digs to your key pieces as you loot and rummage, as well as fuels your Conscriptor with options to consider. Could be that your ideal target is something with immediacy like Olivia Sanguine Reveler to both limit what can block your 10/10 Trampler and swing in immediately to hit the opponent with Annihilator 2. Moving on to white, there are 2 general categories of aggressive cards to talk about here: Artifact Aggro and Token Aggro. The latter is something Rev has been abundantly familiar with as of late, so let's start with the less recent concept. High Forged Overseer is a 1-mana 2/1 construct noble with a triggered ability that fires off whenever another non-token artifact you control enters, allowing you to pay 1 mana to put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control. We do have an artifact aggro piece kicking around in the format, Sculptor's Replica, which has been lacking for a home up to this point. Overseer and the subsequent artifact aggro tools we'll discuss throughout this review could give Replica a real home moving forward, so there is some enticing potential there. We also recently got a 0-mana artifact, something which is always at least worth considering when artifact themes creep into the spotlight. And while Headstones isn't superbly powerful, it's functionally a 2-mana cycler that keys off of artifact synergies and provides incidental graveyard hate to your main deck. Having a way to freely trigger Overseer's ability is nice to help mitigate the inherent mana cost there, but Overseer also just helps smooth out curves by allowing you to have things to do with your mana when you get into the mid-game with a lower curve strategy. On top of it all, it's a 1-mana 2/1. That's always at least worth looking at for aggro plans. Our other one-drop aggro tool is in the other category. Volunteer Firewatch is a 1/1 human with Vigilance and a Coalition trigger to get a +1/+1 counter on it. It's no Kitsune Matriarch, but it does do something the Matriarch can't, which is looking good after you've created tokens. There's no dispute that Matriarch is the better turn 1 play, since it's increasingly difficult to swing in with Firewatch on turn 2 while having Coalition active. One of our best cheap, hasty token makers is rotating out with Cliques of Nylon, so that's definitely going to put a damper on that particular opener. But Firewatch is a scaling threat that is far more reliable overall when going wide, because it's far less demanding on what you do with your mana once your board is set up for it compared to Matriarch. I think together they make for a strong tokens core at 1 mana, nicely covering each other's biggest shortcoming. And while drawing them out of order, where Firewatch comes early and Matriarch comes late, will really sting, when they arrive in the right pattern, it'll probably feel pretty great. Never Seen Again is a monumental addition to the removal pool. It is a single white mana sorcery that exiles target creature, giving its controller a 1/1 colorless Eldrazi Scion to replace it. Let Them Eat Cake, which played a similar role in its day in the format, was one of the best removal spells of both its time and arguably of the format's removal across the entirety of its history. Never Seen Again's biggest shortcoming in comparison is missing on Planeswalkers, but I think that's a small price to pay to hit any creature regardless of mana value. The Scion token is more valuable than a food token generally, but if given the choice between staring down a major value creature or threat, or giving my opponent a 1/1 that they can turn into mana, you do not need to guess which I would rather deal with. Okay, I don't think highly of this card by any measure, but admittedly, one of my recent official Magic fixations has been 1 mana spells that untap creatures, enabling some proper shenanigans with powerful tap abilities, and Falcon Skin Augmentation is something that falls into that category. It's a 1 mana instant that untaps a creature, giving it +1/+1 in flying for the turn, and if you control an artifact, it also gets a +1/+1 counter. Now, we don't have a ton of highly played creatures with tap abilities besides things that just tap for 1 mana, at which point Augmentation just looks a lot less enticing. But there are still some goodies worth considering. Augmentation can get you a second Darkstar Harbinger activation, turning your 1 white mana investment into 2 black mana and 2 extra cards in your hand, usually while also placing a counter on the Harbinger, given you're likely to have artifact token generators with it. Sire of Greatness, meanwhile, offers a second Birthing Pod activation if you can untap it, which could help assemble combo chains should those ever arise. I don't think these cards are desperate for Falcon Skin Augmentation, but I am far less neglectful of this kind of effect than I was a year ago, and I refuse to let this one slip past me unnoticed now. Bolton Wharf Administrator is the newest addition to the long list of white legendary hate bears we have in Revolution, joining the recent pickup of Thalia the Guiding Blade to punish fast interactive spells. He's a 3/2 human advisor for 2 mana, and his only core effect is making spells players cast outside of their main phases cost 1 more to cast. This is a cudgel against flash decks and other reactive strategies to pinch them on mana and help buy more time to push your creatures across the finish line. And the only point of awkwardness I can see is that it interacts unfavorably with Thalia, though ultimately having them both is still a nice guarantee that opposing removal is inefficient at the best of times. Though Bolton does not care about sorcery speed removals, so there are some shortcomings. Rockpile Brutes is up next. It's a simple one. It's a 2 mana 3/1 that gains first strike whenever you cast an artifact spell and only keeps it for the turn. It's a bit awkward looking, primarily due to it not being an artifact itself, so it probably won't get into the artifact aggro suites, but it is pretty annoying to block, so maybe. Scape Surveyor is a 2 mana 1/3 with flying that lets you search up a plains or wastes to your hand when it enters. It's a simple, solid role-playing creature that helps smooth out your land drops, which is nice, and it blocks like a champ in the early turns, which is about all you could ask for in a control deck. The biggest obstacle to reliable play for me is Contrast Coordinator, who is similarly shaped and has a far broader range of cards it can put into your hand, but it doesn't grab colorless sources, and it's overall less reliable because it can miss on lands and miss altogether in some circumstances. Having been on the receiving end of a Concord whiff, I can comfortably say that it is nice to have something that can't whiff. especially since Escape Survivors doesn't place as tight of a deck building demand on you. Being able to dig for action is the real big upside to Concord that Surveyor just can't meet. I think it'll absolutely get some play here and there over the next 4 months, but I think it'll get more play once Contest Coordinators rotates out at the end of the year. Skyforce Retiree isn't a card I have immense hope for by any measure, but it does have a neat evasion ability, and it can share that ability around. It's a 2/2 human pilot citizen that can't be blocked by creatures with power 3 or greater, and its coalition trigger shares that ability to another attacking creature, provided, just another creature, doesn't have to be attacking, provided you are attacking with one or more tokens as well. If you can buff it up, it becomes a lot trickier to kill in combat, and token decks are naturally inclined to spread anthems around to do the same for your tokens anyways. The big issue for me is just that token decks only have room for so many cards that don't create tokens, and I'm not sure that this imperfect evasion ability is quite right for those shells. Jetfoot Greaves is honestly the best reason to play an artifact deck in this next rotation. It's a 2-mana equipment vehicle that equips for 2 and crews for 2. While it's a vehicle, it gets +1/+1 for each artifact you control, including itself. And while it's equipped, it gives the equipped creature that buff. This feels like it'll be the reason to care about Nullblade Artisan going into this new rotation, since the Artisan can quickly benefit from a decently sized board to find your Jetfoot Greaves, and the more you lean into artifact themes, the stronger this gets over time. It's the best reason to care about that unblockable artifact creature land. It's the best reason to care about artifact aggro themes in general. It's just an all-around powerhouse build-around, and I think it'll prove worthy enough to spawn a reliable archetype. As far as other things to put into your Nullblade Artisan package if you build a Jetfoot Greaves deck, there is an argument for Warpwire Chassis as at least a one-of. It's another 2-mana equipment, this one equipping for 3 mana and giving the equipped creature +2/+2 and flying. It's a bit clunky overall, but when the major component is that you can pay 1 mana when it enters to create a 1/1 token and equip the chassis to it immediately, it gets a lot better. A 3-mana 3/3 flyer is a pretty respectable creature at its baseline, and when that body leaves behind the equipment when it dies, it becomes an even better equation. Having the option for your Nullblade Artisan to just find a 3-mana 3/3 flyer or find Skyfall Sunderer as a one-of can give you a lot of room for equipment that to make up for your lack of board presence in more awkward situations after your opponent, sweeps your board, for instance. The flying here also makes it a perfect match for the Greaves, since it's getting around the primary drawback of Greaves, which is that the Jetfoot Greaves don't have any form of evasion. So equipping this to the Greaves, or vice versa, equipping the Greaves to the chassis token, just gets so much done. Up next, we've got a pair of 2-mana fragmenting sorceries, Ether Joyride and Zeppelin Disaster. Both can fragment a creature with differing hoops, with Joyride fragmenting a creature you own before exiling it, allowing you to cast that card from exile as long as it remains there, while Zeppelin Disaster keeps the fragmented creature in play, but only targets creatures you control with mana value 3 or less, though it also comes with a secondary mode to exile an artifact or enchantment. These both rely heavily on what creatures you're looking to fragment, and while Joyride can hit more expensive creatures, I think because it lets you recast the creature you're fragmenting, they both wind up living or dying on the cheapest creatures they can find that are worth fragmenting. Joyride's best candidate in my mind is probably Sunset Sentries, where it can feasibly be recast for 1 mana to allow Joyride to tee up a 1 mana draw card 2/2 in exile. But even there, I can't help but wonder if Zeppelin Disaster is just better at doing that, since you don't have to spend the extra mana to get the sentries back in play. It's just gonna draw you a card off of making the token. Joyride might be the most poignant with Eldrazi, because the cast trigger winds up being the more important factor there. We'll have to wait and see. One mechanical note, Joyride does exile the target even if it's got a splinter counter on it already, so even if the creature can't fragment, it will still get exiled. Last up at 2 mana, we have Timely Intervention. It's a solid 2-mana deal for instant that only hits attacking and blocking creatures, but if you spend a colorless to cast it, it outright destroys the target instead. There are certainly scenarios where this can kill something courtesy of that colorless mode, but I'm not so sure it's worth the trouble when we have Fateful Ascent around, and when we're getting Never Seen Again in this same set. We've got our first colorless card with a white mythos. Xyla's Arbiter is 2 and a colorless for a 3/3 Eldrazi Angel with Flash. A cast trigger to exile up to 1 target non-land permanent, allowing that permanent's controller to cast it for 2 as long as it's exiled, and a single white mana sorcery mythos named Eerie Stillness, which makes spells cost 1 more to cast until your next turn. It's very evocative of the Canon Universes Beyond card Aang Swift Savior, which of course has been a staple of competitive play since its release. There is, of course, the obligatory mention that this is an angel, so Radiant Devotee shenanigans bound, but I want to keep the focus on where it is most prone to mirror Aang, its combo potential. See, much like Aang Swift Savior, you can exile another copy of this that you have in play, getting around the fact that Aang usually needs a different thing with an airbending effect to, start the loop. Here you just need 2 Xyla's Arbiters. You cast one and exile the other with the cast trigger. And then you're in a solid loop state, provided you can find ways to reduce their cost. If you can reduce their cost by 2 mana, casting an Arbiter exiles an Arbiter, which lets you cast an Arbiter to exile an Arbiter, and that's infinite damage with Sieging Volley Mage, or Divinity, infinite life with Hope's Blessed Bow, or the Great Singularity, infinite hasty 1/1 bats off of Cordelia Stromkirk. You can draw your whole deck with Secrecy by doing the loop outside of your main phase because it's got Flash. Or you could draw your deck by having a leveled up Cryptozoologist. Depending on how our cost reducers go, you can even get some flexible additions to the loop with Preemption Daemon, which just has the wrinkle of setting the exiled card's cost to 3 instead. The one bit of trouble for now is that our cost reduction options are rather sparse. The best Arbiter exclusive reducer is probably Morbid Missive, which will only affect either your Eldrazi or your Angels, depending on which one you opt into reducing. And the next best option is Dance of the Three Courts, which does at least insulate the combo a bit from targeted removal, but which would require you to either have at least 1 extra Arbiter in play or 1 in your graveyard. The setup problem is the thing holding this loop back, but if we get more cost reducers in the future, or if the pieces line up properly in Eternal, this combo could be a real force to be reckoned with. Also, bears mentioning, this is just a 3-mana 3/3 with Flash that picks something up off the board for the moment. This is a crazy trick on defense. Less overall excitement for the other colorless card with a white mythos, but it is still pretty solid. Null Emissary is the same cost, this time for a 2/3 Eldrazi Advisor with Vigilance that has creatures that are 1 or more colors enter tapped, alongside its Mythos instant, Catatonia, 1 and a white to tap up to 1 target creature and draw a card. It's just a reasonably annoying creature to put into play, and one which sorely misses the fact that it came just a couple of rotations too late to share any time with Cyberos's Advisor Kindred stuff. Having this effect on a body is always at least somewhat good, and while there are other cards floating around that do similar things, none of them come down with the opportunity to tap another creature and draw a card once they're already in play. I think the Mythos being castable from the board is the piece that pulls Null Emissary up to potentially playable. Because for what's on offer, it is just good enough to play a solid role in shells that might want this effect. Aspiring Artisan is another vigilant creature, this one a 3/3 human artificer with a tap ability to create a 1/1 construct token, but only if you've cast an artifact spell in the turn. This one feels like it's just shy of being worthwhile in the artifact aggro shell, because that condition feels just so slightly unreliable enough to not work out consistently. It's a solid body, and if you can consistently be casting artifact spells, this might work out perfectly, but I can't help but think it's just a little too clunky. North District Prior is a 3-mana 1/1 human cleric that enters with a +1/+1 counter on it for each other creature you control. Has an activated ability for 1 and a white as well, tapping 3 untapped creatures you control to fragment the Prior as a sorcery. It's 2 potentially massive bodies for 1 card, a decently appealing backup plan if you're looking to go wide. And being able to split the cost of those bodies up is also a worthy incentive. Needing to go wide before this comes down feels like the one big hiccup in it all, since it looks far worse the further behind you are. In my head, I've been likening it to Aloris the Pathfinder, who spits out a similar token when he dies, but that token's always as good as your board state is, so if you get your board wiped, Aloris does at least turn into a new body on the board, and that body can get better when you rebuild. I think Prior looks better into small sweepers since it just keeps the stats it set itself at, but I think it might just fall short of playability due to how awful it is when you aren't adequately set up. Otherworldly Gyre is a much appreciated pickup in the toolkit of any slower white strategy, evocative of some of the best anti-aggro tools in recent official standard play. It's 1 white for an enchantment that exiles all creatures with mana value 2 or less when it enters, keeping them exiled until it leaves play. While it's on board, you can pay X and double Colorless as a sorcery to search up and exile a colorless creature card with that mana value or less, making Gyre permanently a copy of the exiled card. It'll still return the exiled creatures back to play when it's removed after that, but if you can transform it into something like Null Emissary, then it can continue to cause trouble for any opponent even after it's hit the table. Our only option for this effect before now was Eltanon the Silent Star, which is still a very solid card in its own right, thanks to Path of Stillness hitting artifacts and enchantments. But the mana cost efficiency of Gyre gives white a way to combat fast aggro strategies like burn and tokens earlier into the game. Elden Crucible is a simple Banishing Light effect, but on an artifact rather than the enchantments we've been used to, and with a long-term card selection effect that could maybe be useful no matter how small it is. It only exiles a creature an opponent controls rather than any non-land permanent, but it also taps to Surveil 1 at the cost of 3 mana, meaning you get a small way to spend excess mana in later turns. Coordinator is probably the biggest factor in Crucible's playability, and since it can put Crucible into your hand, but that's been true of Sealing Strike for 4 seasons now, and ever since we got Sanctum for Repression, that hasn't really mattered, so I don't think that'll really be the case for Crucible as well. If you really are desperate for more artifacts to cast, this is probably why you play Elden Crucible. Otherwise, it's just not up to par. High Sergeant Liano is just a generally good card. He's a legendary 4-mana 2/3 human soldier that creates 2 1/1 humans when he enters, and draws you a card whenever he attacks with 1 or more tokens. A few months ago, we had a very clear archetype for this card to slot into the green-white Honesty shell, where 3 bodies entering at once would yield a ton of power with Honesty, Syra, or Enduring Vow-Holder in play. But with Honesty and Syra both getting nerfed at the start of this prior season, the value of going wide here is really just limited to what anthems you've got rolling. I think Liano has enough going for him as a self-contained value piece to still be worth looking at for mid-range shells, but certainly he would have looked a lot more powerful if we could rewind the clock to March this year. At least we've still got Enduring Vow-Holder. Torvinald Iron Eminence is a similar go-wide tool, this one a legendary 5/5 construct artifact creature for 3 white with Vigilance and Ward 2. At the beginning of your upkeep while Torvinald is in play, it'll put a +1/+1 counter on each of your creatures, including itself. This does have some competition in the slot it occupies, namely between Volwood Warder and Darisha Stack Exec. Darisha is easily the one with the most pedigree behind it, as well as the most immediacy, while Warder was a redesign that, to my knowledge, has not yet received any real play. Torvinald is probably the slowest of the 3, since the other 2 can each get some semblance of immediacy by comparison. So the one real advantage going for it is hinging on that ward cost. Picking off Torvinald specifically is going to be more annoying than removing either of Darisha or Volwood Warder. So against single target removal, Torvinald does get the edge. That being said, Darisha is the best of the 3 into a board wipe, so I imagine Darisha will remain the highlight of this particular trio. We have arrived at what is perhaps my single favorite card of the entire set. Evelyn, Ark of Salvation. It's a 6/6 legendary vehicle with flying, vigilance, and crew 4. When Evelyn enters or attacks, you return an artifact or a creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, and can have it come back tapped and attacking if you get back a creature while Evelyn is attacking. It's no secret that I hold a fondness in my heart for Revolt of the Palace, and Evelyn occupies a very similar spot overall in terms of board impact over time. But the biggest advantage that Evelyn has is similar to Goldport's Rare Land cycle, in that it's a much softer deck-building demand. Yes, you'll want to include some strong 3-mana artifacts and creatures, but you don't need to build around such a high density so as to always get them, because you aren't trying to hit a specific quantity like you are for Revolt of the Palace. This allows Evelyn to be a far more reliable mid-range tool to get back what you need when you need it, and lean on its unearth effects in the same way that you would for something like Stark Mausoleum, just getting back generally good creatures rather than fully maximizing the impact and cheat potential like you would want to for a dedicated unearth deck. Last up in white, we have Grand Triarch, a 7-mana 8/8 Devoid Eldrazi that gives you and your other colorless permanents hexproof. as well as creating a 4/4 Eldrazi token with flying whenever you cast a colorless spell. It's pretty tricky to get this into play at 7 mana, but I do kind of love how hard it can snowball out of control once it hits the table. We have a lot of ways to get extra copies of this between Fragment Effects, Karina's Substitute, Protean Golem, and even any other clone effects you could dare to reach for. And as a result, I can't help but wonder if a white colorless Eldrazi ramp plan could be a real, probably fringe game plan. Gloompool Heron brings us into blue. It's a 1-mana 1/1 bird with flying, which isn't very special, but it does come with a high-cost Haymaker of a Mythos sorcery in Into the Mist, a 5 blue draw 3. This might be a fine enough tempo or ninjas tool as a low-cost creature with evasion that occasionally has late-game relevance, but I think this seems a little better in a blue deck that's intentionally looking to get up to big spells, where the Heron can either be an early-game blocker to trade with a small creature or some late-game value. It's also a Mythos card that seems fairly inadvisable to cast from hand because of just how cheap it is to put it into play. There's really no incentive to hold back from weaving this 1-mana 1/1 into a turn here or there. It's probably too weak to reliably play, but it's surprisingly appealing for a basic 1/1 flyer. One last note, the journal we discussed earlier that can free cast stuff by spending page counters cannot free cast Into the Mist by spending 1 page counter because Mythos spells can only be cast from your hand or from the battlefield. This also means if you impulse draw into a Mythos, you have to play the creature side. Piecing it together is probably the wrong way to start off the discussion about the Clues Matter tools in the set, but it is the cheapest blue card to care about it, so that's where we're going to be starting. It's a 1-mana aura that enchants a creature and gives it a measly +1 power, as well as a combat damage trigger whenever it hits a player to allow you to sacrifice any number of clues you control for free. If your deck can put an ample amount of clues into play, and you don't have any other incentives to keep them around, this could be a pretty great way to crack them all for 1 mana. And in theory, it could start to rival Ancestral Recall in terms of output, depending on how many clues you have in play. The combat damage component is the real issue, though, because if you don't have a clear attack, then this is going to be doing not much more than looking like a pretty meager stat buff. If clues are something we can generate rapidly enough alongside tempo tools, this might be absolutely incredible. And to be fair, this might still be fine alongside Unmarked Headstones and maybe Corrupted Hedron. But that tempo plan's really got to dodge blockers for this to be humming. Devonia Lost Ministrix is a super high value 2-drop. She's a 2/1 legendary Eldrazi advisor with Void, an enter trigger to mill you for 2, and a once per turn trigger when the Void calls you to allow you to exile an instant or sorcery card from your graveyard and cast a copy of it. Now, this can't do much with counter magic since the Void can only call you on your turn, but it can still easily reuse your cantrips or removal spells turn after turn. We just got to see Architect of the Intangible get buffed from double blue to 1 in a blue, and it does more work on curve since it banks the card if you don't cast it immediately, but Devonia's repeated value probably pushes Architect right out of the format, especially when we have something like Thought Scour that can mill yourself to have the Void call again on your turn. The biggest tension point for me is that the deck that this seems the most at home in would be something like the 8 Terrors deck that has been absolutely rocking the format lately. But that deck doesn't want you to be exiling your cards from your graveyard like Devonia is inclined to do. There's this weird tension here, but ultimately one of the 2 Terrors mills a player for 3 when it enters, so that also can let you get a free spell off of Devonia. Potentially a lot of value. Inspired Retrofitter is one of our only cheap looters now that our last 1-mana option is headed out the door with Cliques of Nylon. I don't think it really slots into the same decks by any measure. It's a 1/1 Human Artificer for 2 that loots whenever it becomes tapped, and has a scaling trigger at each end step to gain a +1/+1 counter and untap itself if you cast a non-creature spell in the turn. So you need to cast the spell before the end step, so the second main phase at the latest, but this can start scaling quickly on both players' turns if you can sling non-creature spells on both players' turns. Excuse me. The looting factor probably isn't as critical, so I don't imagine it'll pop up like Gildanoon Entertainer would. But it triggering when the Retrofitter becomes tapped could be nice for flow abilities or vehicles here or there. I suspect Retrofitter would be the most favorable in tempo-leaning shells, where it functions like a pseudo-prowess threat. And in those contexts, it does kind of threaten to swing for 3 the first turn it's able, if you can swing 2 non-creature spells across the turn cycle. But that might be too high of a demand for it to be truly worth the trouble. Diviner of Relics is a blue mana dork, but a bit of a tame one. It's a 1/2 human scholar for 2 that taps for colorless mana, which can only be spent on colorless spells or abilities of colorless permanents. Now, yes, this is intended to do stuff with Artifact and Eldrazi, but you can also use it for land abilities since those are almost always colorless, so this can let you use utility land abilities like the one on Submerged Citadel ahead of schedule. Probably less consistent than just using a mana rock, but it's an option, and options are worth having. What? Okay, we went backwards. My bad. I was confused for a moment. Eldritch Rebuttal is a new entry to the Quench with Upside camp, fighting for space alongside Overrule Will. It's a 1 blue instant that counters a spell unless its controller pays 2. But if you spend colorless mana to cast Rebuttal, it upgrades to a full mana leak and taxes for 3 mana instead. I think decks that care about their graveyards will still naturally gravitate towards Overrule Will, but Rebuttal makes a strong argument for even just dipping your toes into having some colorless sources available, as having a blue and a flexible colorless source up presents a very weird, tricky situation where your opponent might have to intentionally play around something that taxes their spell for 3 mana when you might not have something that taxes them for 3 mana. It just looks really strong. And having an upgrading Quench like this is something I have been itching for a while, and it's an interesting enough deck building requirement that we'll have to see if it starts to break people's habit of leaving 2 mana up for their spells. Spill the Beans is back! For those unfamiliar or who think they might recognize this effect, it's equivalent to Deduce from the official set Murders at Karlov Manor. Though fun fact, Spill the Beans predates it by a fair few years. It hasn't been in Revolution since Season 2 ended and Secrets of the River Cities rotated out on New Year's Day 2022, so a lot has changed for it in terms of the format's context, but I still think it's pretty great. I think the Deuce is pretty great. It's not going to shine to its old heights since we have some very powerful draw spells around and kicking these days, but I've always had a soft spot for Spill the Beans and 4 mana draw 2s in general, and something like this where you get to split the draw across 2 2-mana payments is very nice. So I'm very happy to see this back in the format for Season 17. We've also got another solid 2-mana instant that investigates on top of its other effect. Fade is a 2-mana bounce spell that leaves a clue behind for you to draw later on. It's a pretty stellar bounce effect, and the only comparable tool I can think of is Dream Snare, which doesn't cost extra mana to draw, but only hits creatures, only replaces itself against smaller creatures, and is tighter on your color requirements. I really like the flexibility on offer with Fade. It seems like a superb tool for control decks to reach for, and for even, faster blue decks to consider. Okay, this one is weird for me to evaluate because my opinions are traditionally very low on these sorts of temporary scale-up effects, but there are some magic words here that do have my attention. Writhe Form is 1 in a blue for an instant that makes target creature a 4/4 until end of turn, while granting it hexproof and a card draw on combat damage trigger while it keeps those stats. Those abilities being granted are why this has any legs to me. Hexproof makes it a decently solid combat trick since it can deny removal while messing with combat math, and the draw on damage means that it replaces itself while pushing additional damage on a smaller creature. Selhoff Conduit and friends have really struggled to push blue tempo into the limelight, with prowess-leaning builds just consistently overshadowing them time and time again, but this could maybe help shore things up and give blue tempo a real way to push damage and ensure their creatures can cross the finish line reliably. I can't say I'm holding my breath, but I do want to see tempo get there, so I'll take what I can get. Public Exhibition is a 2-mana aura that turns an enchanted creature or artifact into a clue, stripping it of all other types and abilities beyond the expected draw effect. This feels very adjacent to Fateful Ascent for me, actually, in that it replaces a problematic permanent on your opponent's board with an artifact solely made to turn 2 mana into a card in hand. Obviously, it being an aura means it's possible for the opponent to pick off that removal and reclaim the enchanted permanent, and being sorcery speed and having fewer optional targets is also holding it back. But blue doesn't really get hard removal, so this might be a real point of conversation. I might have even more hopes for Wiped Clean, though. It's also a 2-mana aura, this time with Flash and the ability to enchant any non-land permanent. It also strips away abilities, but doesn't mess with types or grant new abilities. The big show is that Enter trigger, countering the activated and triggered abilities of the permanent if Colorless was spent to cast Wiped Clean. This is a great check to any Planeswalker, battle, enchantment, or artifact, rendering them completely useless for as long as it sits on the board, and also does some great work to punish value-oriented creatures that might have slipped through your counter magic in earlier turns. The colorless mode is just icing on the cake to me in most cases, because you can mess with key enter triggers or disable your own detrimental triggers if you build around it. It's more cute than good when you're leaning on the colorless support, I think, but being able to just point at a battle and say that this does absolutely nothing is nice. Although I guess at that point, you could just run a counterspell. Blacksite Asylum is our last properly typed clue card of the set. It's 1 and a blue for a clue with flash that taps a creature an opponent controls and puts 2 stun counters on it when it enters. Then it just sits in play until you cash it in. This does make 3 separate 2-mana blue spells at instant speed in Goldport that put clues into play. Though Asylum's not repeatable in the same way as the others because it's an artifact and not an instant. So different synergies there. But I think this could be a solid role player. The stun can really be useful. Probably not going to be as important as Fade, but it's neat. Roiling Undertow is the other big bounce spell of Goldport, with one pretty critical caveat. You have to pay a bunch of mana into it and have an eligible target for the first mode on your board to cast it. It's X and double blue for a sorcery that both fragments a creature you control with mana value X or less, and returns up to X target creatures to their owner's hands. This can be used to pick up the creature you're fragmenting by targeting it with both halves, but if you don't have a legal target for the fragment mode, you can't cast it. So if your board's empty and you need to bounce everything your opponent has, you better hope to have a cheap enough creature in hand to make the mana requirements work. That being said, being able to pick up the fragmenting creature has some loop potential with Architect of the Intangible, and this being a fragment spell in blue finally allows me to address the creature I am most terrified of with regards to fragmenting. Umber Grove Tender. It's a creature that is already at its best in multiples, as we have seen with its canon counterpart Risen Reef, and just so happens to be great at getting extra lands into play to make Roiling Undertow more approachable to cast for significant impact. I think this could be a very real factor in Druid decks moving forward, because that's where the mana demand is most easily met and where the scariest fragment target on my radar lives. Up to 3 mana, we have Lightwire Swarm, a card that will sorely miss the looters of yesteryear. It's a 3-mana 2/2 construct with flying and an end-step trigger, creating either 1 flying Thopter if you've drawn 2 cards in the turn, or 2 Thopters if you've drawn 3 or more cards instead. Looters are obviously the quickest way to reliably meet this demand, but Ignited Soul is headed out the door, and was our last reliable way to do so at 1 mana, so we've got to turn to our 2-drops instead. I do think we could see some play for it alongside the likes of Wistful Strategist and Gilded Noon Entertainer, but I can't help but think about this alongside Become the Hunted and Company, because looting this away and then unearthing it for 4/4 worth of stats that turn is just so enticing. It might have a real shot at rebuilding blue-red looters, because this is just an incredible top end to a fabricated anomaly curve. Anomaly getting to watch this come into play and start scaling both the Swarm and its Thopter is pretty nice. Malignant Manaphage might be the coolest 3-mana counterspell we've ever had. It's 1 and a double blue for a 2/1 Eldrazi Shapeshifter with Devoid and Flash. When it enters, if it was cast, it causes up to 1 target spell to become a copy of the Manaphage, except it loses the protection from Eldrazi ability that the Manaphage has inherently. Where this lands is that it can replace any opposing spell, no matter how threatening, with a 2/1 that could, I guess, maybe technically do the same thing to another spell that's still on the stack, if my understanding is correct, since that spell was cast, probably. But otherwise just does absolutely nothing and can't even damage the creature that scuttled it. This is just such a cool tool for flash shells, to the point where I can't stop thinking about it in even just ordinary control decks. It's such a cool design. Freda is giving me some nightmare flashbacks to the start of this year, because she sure looks a lot like Clash at Mistrit Vale to me on the surface. She's a 3-mana 1/3 flying human bard that creates a 1/1 blue illusion whenever you cast a non-creature spell. Where she diverts from Clash, however, is that rather than scaling those tokens, she can tap for 1 and a blue to tap any number of untapped creatures with total power X and copy a non-creature spell with mana value X or less. Creating the token on cast of a non-creature spell means that if you're 1 power shy from having enough stats on board to copy the spell you're casting, Frida will cover the difference by making the token to tap it for her second ability. So Clash at Mistrit Vale's old first ability merged somewhat with the rotating transform side of Research Grant, two of the key pieces that made Blue-Red such an unflinching menace during Solstice season. Not being a non-creature spell herself is the one major drawback I can see here, but that is honestly such a small downside compared to the potential output on offer here, to the point that I can't help but flinch at the sight of her. I think she scares me more than any of the Eldrazi that are meant to be frightening me. Now for a value 3 drop that's less terrifying. Harbor Inspector is a 2/4 human detective for 3 that investigates on enter and tacks a Surveil 1 onto the sacrificing of any clue, superseding the draw effect to effectively make your clues into eavesdrops. The only exception to all of this is that if you're sacrificing them all at once, like to the piecing it together trigger, the Surveil ones will not all happen before the draws. The draws in piecing together happen as part of the resolution of the sacrifice effect, so you'll just get a bunch of Surveil ones after you've drawn. Realistically, this is a pretty mediocre card, but 2/4 is a nice stat line, so if you care about clues, maybe you do reach for this. In the Nick of Time is, on its surface, a pretty cute cancel variant, but I feel like it just is a fully souped up disallow. It's 1 in double blue for an instant that counters up to 1 target spell, up to 1 target activated ability, and up to 1 target triggered ability. It's pretty hard to hit multiple things while hitting an activated ability here, but this shuts down both an Eldrazi Titan and its cast trigger, a non-creature spell plus the prowess trigger it's being used to get, a creature spell plus the muster trigger it's being used to get, and so on. Disallow was eminently playable as a counterspell in its day, and this is just better in every measurable way to my reading. Could even shut down a fetch land, letting it serve as a blue stone rain. I have seen next to no chatter about this one, but I think it really deserves the attention. Collaborate is an easier card to judge. It's 2 and a blue for a sorcery that looks at the top 3 cards of your deck, puts 2 into your hand and 1 into your graveyard. It's like a slightly bigger strategic planning, which isn't especially bad by any measure, but 3 mana does put a much bigger hurdle in its way compared to planning. Granted, our best comparison point right now is Tireless Refutation, which costs more mana. So Refutation might justify its cost a little worse, but Refutation's an instant with some flexibility beyond the draw power, so I think the sorcery speed timing on Collaborate is kind of the death knell here. Ancestral Voidstone is 2 and a blue for an artifact that surveils 2 on enter, taps for a colorless, or can be tapped for 1 mana to surveil 1. It's neat to have this for colorless decks, but I think we just get better artifacts for ramping in those shells, so not too keen on this. Lost Lands Auspex is a very curious mythic with some interesting synergies. It's a 4-mana 3/5 Angel Warlock with flying and a once per turn replacement effect to swap out creating 1 or more of a token withdrawing that many cards. So the obvious note here is that this freely cracks open a clue here and there, and if you make a bunch of tokens, you could just draw a bunch of cards instead. It's got some relevant creature types, Angel and Warlock both play into Twiltree themes, but the big eye catcher for me is that this might be the missing piece for confronting Time's Jailer. CTJ has, since its release, always hovered somewhere in the realm of being the worst of the time loop sagas, and being just a bit shy of being one of the best, owing its faltering points squarely to the phase-out mode being a falter at the best of times, and the time bubble enchantments just being too much of an inevitable liability. Zukar Null Champion gave us the first piece to making this puzzle actually work by allowing you to donate those time bubbles to the opponent and eventually price them out of casting spells. And now Auspex gives us a way to just not get the time bubbles at all by drawing a card in its place. Both Auspex and Zukar costing 4 is actually perfect for these interactions, since a curved out CTJ into either 4-drop means you'll have a way to dismiss the time bubble on curve, provided the opponent can't disrupt it. That is a non-insignificant if, of course, but given that Auspex and Zukar also just naturally work well together, with Angel overriding either of Zukar's negative tokens as well, and I think this could make for a really interesting controller mid-range core for the 2 seasons that we still have confronting Time's Jailer, at least. Ego Devourer is a clone effect and is evocative of the best clone Revolution has arguably ever had. It is 2 and double blue for a 2/2 shapeshifter, which you may have enter as a copy of any creature in play, except it retains the ability to tap and fragment itself for another 2 blue mana. It's not quite Wildkin Imposter, but it's undeniable that the bones are there for a very similar card overall. And if there's something in play that's worth cloning, you can almost be guaranteed to know it's worth cloning twice. Also worth noting, since you're likely to be looking for good enter triggers to copy, this is a valid pickup for Contest Coordinator for its final season, and it might be a missing piece to make Plush Collection come together. Scour the Records is another bit of competition for the Tireless Refutation slot, and where it lacks in flexibility, it attempts to make up for in selection power. It's 2 and a double blue instant that looks at either the top 4 or top 7 cards of your library, digging deeper if you have Threshold active, and puts 2 of those cards into your hand before shipping the rest to the bottom of your library in a random order. I do think the flexibility on Refutation is just a bit better overall, but I won't deny that this is some nice dig power to have access to. Scion of Insanity is our last proper mono blue card, since the remainder are the Mythos creatures in Colorless. And it's a doozy to end off on. It's 3 and double blue for a 4/4 flying avatar that gets +3/+3 as long as your deck is below half the minimum size or less, 30 in a traditional match. So at 29 or fewer cards in a Revolution match, this is a 5 and a 7/7 flyer with no other text. It clocks fast, but kind of just sits there begging to eat interaction. The other thing it has going on is its discard mode, which lets you pay 1 and a blue to discard it, milling 3 cards and then drawing a card and then shuffling it into your library, but I'm ultimately just a bit stumped on how to feel about this. In grindy control matchups, this is a real deal threat that serves as a decent early cantrip, I guess, but I don't know if that's actually worth the trouble of getting so deep into your deck. It's not terrible, I just can't confidently say it's great. We're wrapping blue up with its 2 Mythos Eldrazi, like I mentioned, since they sit really high up on the curve. For Void Empyrean, it's just kind of a worse Baleanos Chrysalis in almost every way. It's, I've been saying that wrong this whole time. Sorry, I just realized this. I remember realizing this when I was writing the script, and it just came back into my mind. Baleanos Chrysalis. I've been saying it like the E comes before the A after the L. And I'm taking the L, and I'm going to not get sidetracked. Good lord. Void Empyrean's 5 colorless, 5/6 Eldrazi with flying. It returns up to 1 target creature you don't control to its owner's hand, and surveils 3 when you cast it. And its Mythos sorcery is Spurn Reality, a single blue mana to bounce a creature with mana value 3 or less to its owner's hand. Let's talk upsides first, since there aren't really many. If you have reasons to care about Eldrazi, it's an Eldrazi. If you're casting this, it's less vulnerable to counter magic, since the cast trigger still goes off, and it's got flying, so it's going to be able to connect to the opponent more reliably. And you can bounce your own cheap things? That sounds like a lot, but I feel like Baleanos Chrysalis just is better. It doesn't go away if you want to use the spell from hand. Spell can be used at instant speed, unlike Spurn Reality. Its in-play bounce effect is repeatable rather than being a one-shot. Chrysalis has seen play here and there as a bounce spell that dodges duress. I don't think Void Empyrean will be able to make the same claim, unfortunately. Finally, there's Ink Realm Guardian, a 7 and a colorless 7/9 Eldrazi Leviathan with Trample and Ward 2. While it's in play, you draw 2 cards whenever any of your creatures deals combat damage to a player, which is a ton of draw power, albeit for a very steep cost. Its Mythos sorcery, All Collapse, is 4 and a blue to make your entire board unblockable for the turn, nearly guaranteeing that you'll be able to either kill or at least get your opponent close to being dead. This is definitely too expensive for the traditional token decks we've seen, and blue hasn't gotten to be a major factor in those often anyhow, but I do think this gives us an excuse to discuss one of the cards I've been looking at for an excuse to cover as far as the Eldrazi are concerned. Wharf Forge Master represents a huge window of opportunity to cheat the costs on these colossal creatures, provided you have enough tokens in play, while already being a pretty solid body for the rate. The mana might be a tad too tricky for Bant plus Colorless to come together, but with blue packing some stellar underplayed token tools like Hushed Briefing, it really feels like a matter of time until some of these pieces start to click into place and enable you to cast some massive Eldrazi for cheap, courtesy of them having affinity for tokens. It's the midpoint of the review! Well, like I mentioned earlier, this would normally come after the black cards. With the colorless section being moved up in the order, I'm taking a break here to catch my breath. You shouldn't notice too much of a pause here since I'll just be pausing the recording, so no wait on your end. Before I go, though, it's good time to remind you that while I'm hydrating, it's good for you to do so as well, and maybe not right on top of your computer, as I've had to learn the hard way today. While you're at it, be sure to check out all of those links in the description to find the resources to dive into the format yourself. Be right back. Alrighty, kicking off the black cards, we've got Luxuries Merchant, a 1/2 human for 1 that surveils 1 when it dies. This is just not up to par with the other 1-mana black creatures we've got right now for Sacrifice Shells. Pathetic Cocoon puts more token fodder into play, Sacrificial Lamb draws you a whole card, Willing Acolyte drains the opponent for 2. The one reason it's here is that the 1/2 stat line is better than most of these cards typically get. It can soak up damage from 1/1 tokens, but for a card that wants to die, that might not even be that much of an upside. Harrowing Transformation is also a sacrifice-oriented card, this time an instant that gives a creature you control Death Touch, while giving it a death trigger for the turn to leave an Eldrazi Scion behind. It does feel like a rough facsimile of the 1-mana creatures we've had that leave treasures behind when they die, and since the rework to Omen Skulker, Black hasn't had access to anything like that. I'm not sure it'll perform the same, since it's dependent on having a different creature that wants to die rather than just having this go on its lonesome, but your banked mana being on a creature does also give some nice power to sacrifice plans, so maybe this could come together. Blood Soliloquy is Bone Shards. Well, it's Bone Shards that can't target Planeswalkers. We just got Bone Shards this past season. I don't think you play Blood Soliloquy over it, and I don't think you need a 5th copy of it. It's just a bit of an unfortunate overlap. The 2-drop slot is where Black starts to really get cooking in Goldport. Insatiate Slasher is a 3/2 Spirit Assassin for 2 black mana, and you can cast it from your graveyard as long as the Void called you this turn, gaining haste when it enters if you do so. It sits right alongside Reconstructed Flare to give us 8 total copies of 2-mana creatures that can be recast as long as you've discarded a card, with each also having their own additional way to be recast, between Slasher also liking when you mill or surveil, and Flare liking when your opponent discards. We're inching ever closer towards some sort of combo chain, because these are 2 separate creatures that can be endlessly recast from your graveyard for 2 mana at a time. Cover's Altar can sacrifice them for a single treasure. If we get a token doubler that's 2 treasures, we would just need to figure out how to untap the Cover's Altar at that point. Haunted Starlet is a 2-mana 1/2 human bard with lifelink and a once per turn trigger to lose 1 life and create an Eldrazi Scion when another creature you control with power 2 or less enters. It's very similar to Forsaken Penitence, and the pair work quite nicely together, leading me to believe Starlet will become a major part of more sacrifice-oriented token strategies. That being said, it's also just a generally good card. It effectively can just be treated as making your first 2 power or less creature each turn cost 1 less mana or generate a colorless mana for you alongside everything else it does, because, you know, if you're trying to chain spells together, turn 3 you play a 2-drop, you get a Eldrazi Scion, you play a second 2-drop with the Eldrazi Scion mana. Makes getting a mana lead over your opponent far more reliable over several turns, and makes me think Starlet has a lot of room to shine overall. Elite Reserve is another way to either sacrifice creatures or discard cards for some utility, but I think this one falls short of being useful for decks looking for either of those things. It's 2-mana 2/2 human soldier with flash, and you can pay 1 generic mana and either sacrifice a creature or discard a card to give it indestructible for the turn and tap it. 1 mana to sack outlets are a bit clunky, with the best one likely being Inklight Dancer, which has fallen off over time, and 1 mana to discard outlets are even more sparse in their overall playability. It's got some nice flexibility for sacrifice and reanimator plans, but I don't think it comes together in a way I can say I have faith in. Shingle Crawler feels a bit simple, but simple could still be good. It's 2-mana 2/1 bat horror with flying that can't block, and makes you surveil 1 whenever it attacks. winds up being one of the most consistent ways to have the Void call you each turn, since you can just mill yourself for 1 when you attack with it, and it fuels another 2-mana 2/1 that seems pried to be good in a strategy that wants to be calling the Void. Malicious Pact Maker has been itching for a buddy, since it's a scaling threat that asks you to keep surveilling as often as possible. Getting to surveil and attack with the Shingle Crawler means you've got surveilling on your turn covered, and the Pact Maker's Acolyte token can be saved to surveil on the opponent's turn, maximizing the rate which you're scaling your Warlock. They might have a real home together in a self-mill aggro shell. Lantern in the Dark is our first Mythos creature in black. Sorry, brain tracking a thing I mentioned later in the review, and remember that I missed the opportunity to mention it here, so I'm going to mention it here off the script. So Lantern in the Dark is a 2/1 Eldrazi citizen with lifelink, and has the League Below Mythos sorcery, which casts for 3 and a black to surveil 2, draw 2, and lose 2 life. If you're desperate for a cheap Eldrazi, this might be a nice bit of added value on top of the body, but it's just kind of a worse rate than Beckon the Beyond in terms of actual draw power. You just spend 1 more mana for Beckon the Beyond on the chance that you get it in play as a creature first. The thing I realized only later on in scripting the review, and we'll come back to this interaction, is that I only late into this review mentioned that Beckon the Beyond is getting so much better in this set because we're getting so many new Eldrazi to get from outside the game and put into your hand. That's just a very big deal. It makes all of these kind of awkward Eldrazi where the Mythos is like good, but not something you want to put in the main deck, better, because you can just get it out of the sideboard with Beckon the Beyond. We have seen Wish effects be very good in Revolution. Granted, they have been most powerful when they're being used to combo, and there are some Eldrazi that can combo. Beckon the Beyond grabs Eldrazi Titan out of your sideboard, so you can discard it and reanimate it. It can grab you Lantern in the Dark, so you can surveil 2, draw 2, and lose 2 life, rather than just using the Beckon the Beyond to surveil 2, draw 2, lose 2 life. The point of all of this is that I put it into this slide when scripting the review and completely missed the whole get an Eldrazi from outside the game thing at this point in scripting the review. My defense is that it was very late at night, I want to say on Monday night. I realized Beckon Beyond was good with all of the Eldrazi today. And it's Wednesday that I'm recording this, so we make these mistakes. Anyways, enough of being off script. Unwelcome Tenant is a comparison I made between Scion tokens and treasures earlier. It's a 2/2 for 2 with Devoid and a Death Trigger to spit out an Eldrazi Scion. I mentioned during the Valir review how low my hopes were for Elite Aspirant, and they remain low. But I do think I'm slightly more fond of the Tenant here. There's something to be said for Scion tokens just being 1/1 creatures, so they can meaningfully participate in combat. They can actually help kill the opponent, and they're fodder for more than just their own sacrifice ability. I don't think the Tenant's going to be a format-defining common, but I do think it's got far better odds than Elite Aspirant, unfortunately for the Mercenary. Quick and Painful is another riff on the small removal spell with the big shot. With the shot of hitting something big. I broke my own brain there for a second. Another small removal spell that could kill something big, with a condition being met. This time, it's a creature with either power 3 or less, or any creature if the Void has called you this turn. Because the Void only calls you on your own turn, it kind of just winds up being the 2-mana Destroy a thing with power 3 or less, or just Fell from Bloomburrow, because the guaranteed removal is most likely to come up at sorcery speed. As a result, I don't think it gets there over Sovereign's Execution, because unless you're really worried about your life total, I just don't know if it really matters. And even then, you could just play Hang. Hang is this, but just have a 3 mana value permanent in play, which is not a difficult ask these days. It's just kind of unfortunate, ultimately, that I think Quick and Painful is just a bit below the rest of the competition. I think it, more than most of the cards that care about the Void calling you, really suffers for the Void only calling you on your turn. Night Grasp is another Void Matter's removal spell. This time it's a 2-mana aura that gives a creature -2/-2 or -6/-6 if the Void's called you in the current turn. This is just worse than Quick and Painful. And I already talked about how I don't think Quick and Painful is all that good. So unless you're desperate for auras that remove things, and we've got better options in most cases, you're probably not playing this. One last bit of creature interaction at 2 mana. This time I think it's actually really good. Compelled to Die is 1 and a black for a sorcery that has target player sacrifice a non-token creature of their choice and lose 2 life. The only alternative we have to this right now is Tragic Accident, which does have the upside of being at instant speed, but 2 mana is a lot better than 3, and the guaranteed 2 damage is better than the possibility of making a treasure token. I think Compelled to Die is a solidly appealing edict right now, considering it circumvents the best way to get through edicts, and I could see it sneaking into some sideboards at the very least. Learn from Loss is tempting to fill the empty space being left behind by Deadly Dispute rotating out next month, but I'm not quite sure it gets there. It sacrifices a creature as an additional cost to surveil 1 and draw 2 cards, which is perfectly fine by all measures, but with Sundering the Fleet still around, we've got raw card draw covered. The big appeal for Dispute was getting the treasure token, so it doesn't quite do the same. But granted, if this made an Eldrazi Scion, this would probably be kind of ridiculous, so I'll settle for this over, something that properly replaces Deadly Dispute. North Salkman Vigil is one of the only cards I almost left out of this review, but was reminded that there's actually some really nice things to like about this. It's just a standard strategic planning or ransack the lab effect at face value. 2 mana sorcery, look at the top 3, 1 to hand, rest to graveyard. Where it gets interesting is what it does when it's in your graveyard. You can spend 1 and a black to exile it from your graveyard, draw a card, and lose 1 life, if the Void called you this turn. There are some pieces floating around for a self-mill aggro shell across black, green, and blue, so there's certainly some merit to the idea that this could just be an easy include to have something that ends up in your graveyard and replaces itself when you're empty-handed. There's been some experimentation in official play around Resentful Revelation, though usually index to generate a bunch of mana. But when you only need 2 mana to return this from a card in your graveyard to a card in your hand, you really don't need to lean on the ramp component. And when we got things like Setral Arborist and Disciple of Darker Powers that are really desperate for you to fill your graveyard quickly, this might actually really do the trick. Vile Reef Inquisitor is that one exception I mentioned when I broke down the distribution of Investigate. It's the only time this appears outside of green and blue in the set. It's a 3/3 human detective with lifelink for 1 and double black, creating a clue and losing you 1 life whenever another non-token creature you control dies, and allowing you to sacrifice 3 clues to tutor any card to your hand and then shuffle. The most immediate comparison to be made would be to something like Kage's Mercenary, which draws you a card and has you lose 1 life as your non-token creatures die. So this has the initial appearance of being far slower, but the reality to me is that this says every 3 creatures you have die gets you a free Grim Tutor. Yeah. Yeah. The more ways you have to investigate, the more this can just pinpoint find any and every card you could want and put them into your hand. And as we'll get into later in the review, there are some pretty good ways to make clue tokens, leading me to the belief that despite blue and green being the best investigate colors, I think you don't get away with playing an investigate deck built around clues without at least considering playing black for Vile Reef Inquisitor, because what a card! And this is also just an insane pickup for aristocrats, because card draw is great in sacrifice decks. Tutors are the things that end the game in aristocrats decks. This is a crazy, crazy mythic. Yes, I would love to get Grim Tutor for free. Please and thank you. Esme Lost to Avarice is another 3/3 for 1 and double black, this time a legendary human warlock that drains your opponent for 1 life once per turn when the Void calls you, and you can spend 3 and double black while you're at it to, while you're at or above threshold, 7 or more cards in your graveyard, to make her a 7/7 horror with flying permanently. I feel like she's got some bones shared with Eyes of the Overseer in the 1 per turn drain ability department, but it's just a bit awkward that she costs 3 to cast and only drains your opponent for 1 every turn cycle while requiring you to jump through hoops to do so. Eyes of the Overseer has a similar problem, but it's got far less far lower opportunity cost because it's a 1-drop, and it can be triggered on your turn and your opponent's turn at least, so there's, twice the output. Honestly, it's hard not to just frame Esme in my head as akin to most of the weaker level-up creatures and errors in the Weft, where you get a decent but not astonishing body up front and have to invest far more mana just to get a slightly better body for the investment. A 7/7 flyer for 5 mana is great. A 7/7 flyer for 8 mana that requires you to be at threshold? Probably not, even if you have to split up the payments across multiple turns. Much like the 5 mana 7/7 flyer in blue, I just kind of don't see what you're looking to be doing with this. Corpse Inspector is another 3/3 for 1 double black. This one's a human cleric and also cares about the Void calling you, allowing you to exile a card from your graveyard, not a creature. Could be a creature. Exile a card from your graveyard once per turn when the Void calls you. When it dies, it pops into a bunch of mana and 2/1 Warlock tokens, making a creature for each creature card it exiled and a black mana for each non-creature card it exiled. It's hard to pin down how playable this is because on one hand it's a 3-drop that you need to have die. Something you don't often want to be at when 2-drops with beneficial death triggers are already struggling to see play usually. But if afforded enough room to do so, this is a lot of potential bodies wrapped up into one creature. It might look like this is awkward that this is a 3-drop to have it exist alongside Searin Covetous Creation at face value, but with Searin flipping for 1 mana, you actually just get to play either of these at 3 mana, and then the other at turn 4 alongside Transforming Searin, at which point you just make Acolyte tokens, feed 1 into her Sacrifice ability to do the Surveil 1 for free. That calls the Void, you get the Corpse Inspector exile, and you can just build up value on Corpse Inspector turn after turn after turn, and then eventually pop it for a bunch of creature tokens. Realistically, this is probably too slow, but I do appreciate how good the synergy is here. Karsten's Thought Police is a 3-mana 2/3 human advisor that looks at and strips a non-land card from an opponent's hand when it enters, letting them draw a new card to replace it. It can also be fragmented as a sorcery by tapping it and paying 4 and a colorless. If you're looking for hand attack creatures, it'll be hard to justify this over Exorcist of Errors, but getting rid of the card for good is nice, and having an activated ability does make it a better pair for contest coordinator decks. Also worth mentioning, Exorcist does just like other things that let you peek at your opponent's hands to break the whole minigame of it. It's not going to be a staple most likely, but there are some solid merits to the Thought Police. Didn't think I'd ever say that in my life. Soul Survivor is one of the scariest Blood Artist effects we've had in a hot minute. It is a 3-mana 1/1 human citizen that creates an Eldrazi Scion when it enters, and which drains the opponent for 1 whenever it or another creature you control dies. We have already seen how dangerous cheap Blood Artists that make their own fodder can be, courtesy of the prominence of Smiling Sludge at the height of Aristocrat decks earlier this year. And while Soul Survivor isn't as cheap, it comes with fodder that actively makes up for the mana difference by paying back some of the cost while yielding a trigger. This feels like a very dangerous payoff for Aristocrat decks, and while it's certainly frail enough to be able to kept in check by interaction, this is something I don't think you can afford to ignore. Screeching Portent looks like it's probably pretty disposable. It's a 3-mana 2/1 flyer at common. You could discard a card to make a 2/1 Warlock that can't fly. But I do think actually making a pair of 2-power creatures could be worthwhile for the right deck. Specifically a deck that cares about that discard. We only have so many ways to put two-power bodies into play right now, and most of the options we have are not especially defensive. Advance of the Hollow Wake doesn't put any things that can block into play. Dreadchant Warcaller's tokens can't block either. Runstalker Maiden can have both of its bodies block, but the Maiden has enough value that you probably don't want to be blocking with it, and you can't do anything in the face of flyers. So as a result, having flying makes this a much better defensive tool, as well as more likely to push damage through when you have the opportunity. And secondly, I think it's just about looking about why you'd want a defensive tool like this. If you're looking for a defensive option, you might only reach for one of these kinds of defensive tools if it incidentally sets up your game plan. All of this to say, I think this is a Reanimator card. Unironically. I genuinely, honestly, wholeheartedly think this is a real card for reanimation-oriented decks, allowing you to pitch reanimation targets or your Reclaim the Fallen on turn 3 while putting up a pair of blockers to buy yourself time against aggro or tempo plans, which have been some of the more dominant strategies as of late to my understanding. Now, for black-red Reanimator, you have Shigani or Burns, you have why am I blanking on Anomaly? It's going to bother me that I'm blanking on the first word for Anomaly. You have Anomaly, you have the puzzle box tokens. Those tend to summarily handle the self-discard aspect of Reanimator, but blue-black Reanimator has not gotten a ton of work as late, despite Weft Dancer being, in my opinion, one of the best reanimation spells we have, and despite the recent rework to Yiss Trace Talker. They point to a different direction for reanimation targets compared to Privilege Escalation, but we are getting 3 utterly massive Eldrazi Titans this rotation that all hit like freight trains, and any opportunity to break up the monopoly of reanimation targets that is Privilege Escalation is an opportunity I will very gladly take. Strike Suppressor is 1 and double black for a 2/3 Construct Advisor artifact creature with Flash, giving other creatures -1/-1 until end of turn when it enters, and draining your opponents whenever they create creature tokens. This doesn't really require more to elaborate upon. It is absolutely backbreaking for go-wide token decks when they don't have an Anthem. Just sweeps up their board and can punish their attacks by also making this just kill any any attacker with 3 or less health, because this doesn't shrink itself. Their weaker boards get punished. This pads your life total against any future attempts they have to rebuild their boards, because you gain life equal to the tokens they create in addition to having them lose that much life. It's a killer combat trick outside of just token decks, because you can still like swing combat in your favor. And it only dies if the creature that it's blocking has 4 or more power baseline. It's just a solid potential mid-range staple. Soulflame Immolator is the fragment card most inclined towards abuse potential, and for obvious reason. It's a 4-mana 4/4 Spirit Warlock with flying and ward, pay 4 life, which allows you to pay X life as a sorcery to activate to fragment any target non-token creature you control with that mana value. Obviously, this means you can pay 4 life to immediately fragment the Immolator for a 1/1 flyer to accompany this and have a better shot at preserving the activated ability. But there's something else to really like here, which is that this lets you make 1/1 copies of all of your non-fragmented tokens for free. Grab this off of a contest coordinator, curve it out, and pay 2 life to spin again on the Concord. You make a pair of 1/1 golems with the Ruins Awaken, then make another pair of them with the Soulflame Immolator for 0 life paid. I might single-handedly push black into the conversation for go-wide token strategies, because it just quietly doubles up your board and is best with things that cost no mana, where this is just no life spent to double up all of your tokens, especially if the opponent can't pick it off when you play it. Croak is 3 into black for an instant that destroys a creature and costs 2 less to cast if a creature you control died this turn. Very similar bones to With Impunity from Valir, although that checks for you to have sacrificed a permanent for the discount and exiles the target instead. Something you have like some more control over in some cases and less control in other. Rather than the usual assessing of which of these is more worthwhile, let's take a rare opportunity to revel in Overlap. This is another quote-unquote 2-mana removal spell for Jund 4-drops. I've been thinking more and more about the mana value 4 or greater theme supported by Kitsuo and Valir lately, what with Outskirts Steward and Portal Guardian both being pauper legal for this last month of League play. But the current rotation gives us more goodies for the synergy package between Melodious Mallard, Uncoiling Realmspawn, Majesty, and Shroud Warder Phoenix. Yes, that's a lot of potential deck slots dedicated to things that are mostly not mana value 4 or greater, but I like to think of it as a baseline that can get trimmed down in favor of more cost-reducing big spells. I have liked black as the third color in part for With Impunity, and now Croak adds more redundancy to that slot. Now, I'll be fully honest, I think this deck is just more janky than good, but I love the package here if Valir's support of that theme didn't make it obvious, and I'll take any opportunity I can to get excited for its future potential. Unnatural Torment is a light sweeper, giving all creatures -2/-2 for the turn while surveilling 2. The only problem? Costs 4 mana compared to the 3 we usually see this effect at. Now, credit where it's due, Surveil 2 is a very solid bonus effect to staple onto a spell like this, but I'm not sure it's worth being able to cast this on, being unable to cast this on turn 3 against tokens and other aggro plans. Aspis Venefear, Failed Gateway, and Bloodletting all just kind of push it out of contention, I think. Maybe if there's a fair mana value for a Greater Shell that isn't so invested to the board? Who's to say? Herald of Darkest Skies is our other black mythos creature, casting for 4 and a colorless as a 4/4 Eldrazi with flying, and mills any number of target players for 10 cards on cast. Its mythos sorcery, Arise, allows you to cast a target creature card from your graveyard this turn, giving you a solid bit of creature recursion, but a fair means of doing so since it won't cheat any mana. As a result, this definitely points towards a mid-range shell rather than anything scammy, since Arise just gets additional value by getting back a core threat for 1 more mana. If you're willing to make the colorless mana requirement for this, it could be a real mid-range tool. Dissenter Colossus is a 5-mana 2/5 construct artifact creature with a spicy enter trigger, allowing you to discard a card to fragment target creature you control. Once it's in play, it anthems your attacking creatures with 2 or less power, giving them +1/+0, Death Touch, and lifelink until end of turn when they attack. This does stack how you want it to in multiples, and funnily enough, it can inherently come in multiples since that enter trigger can target the Colossus. It's kind of funky that black can drop a 5-mana creature that gives all of your smaller creatures +2 power, lifelink, and death touch for the cost of 2 cards, but that's not all this thing can do. With the right setup, you can actually start assembling flicker loops by fragmenting something like Soft Step Vowkeeper, Refresh Daemon, or Auroric Savior, having the fragmented version blink out the original, and start gradually amassing more value by blinking out the Colossus, alongside maybe creatures that cantrip on enter to make up for the card cost on fragmenting with the Colossus. It almost certainly will not be the most powerful plan in 1v1, but it's just silly enough of an engine that I can't help but love it. Story time! Little known fact about me, but my brief stint playing official Magic the Gathering Standard came right around the window of Shadows over Innistrad and Eldritch Moon, where I played Seasons Past Control and then White Blue Spirits when Eldritch Moon came out. Seasons Past Control, as a result, is one of my all-time favorite decks to pilot for how complex the decision trees could get and how much emphasis there was on pilot skill as the game went deeper and deeper. And as a result, I came out of that standard with Dark Petition being one of my absolute favorite cards in the entirety of the official game. We've never quite had anything that takes the same shape as it, coming closest with Dabbling Dangerously from Blood Like Rivers, but Tendrils in the Loch feels very evocative of that feeling. It's 4 and double black for a sorcery that searches up any card to your hand and makes a pair of Eldrazi Scions on the way out. 6 mana is a huge difference compared to 5, and so is only making 2 mana instead of 3, but that mana banking in the form of Eldrazi Scions is a pretty sizable win, and there's just enough here that reminds me of Dark Petition that I can't help but want to find a home for Tendrils in the Loch somewhere over these next 2 years. If you get a token doubler, this is 4 Eldrazi Scions, and at that point it really does mirror Dark Petition in terms of mana refunded. Yeah, I love Dark Petition, and anything that's Dark Petition shaped is gonna hit the softest parts of my heart. I'm so happy to see this. Oop. Last in black, we have Fathomless Invocations, a 4 and double black modal sorcery with 4 truly awful modes, but 1 very fun sub-game. Those modes are awful because you're not getting affected by all of them. Starting with you, and until all modes have been chosen, each player chooses one that hasn't been chosen. Your choices are to lose 7 life, discard your hand, exile all but the last 6 cards of your deck, or let your opponents each get a 10/10 Eldrazi token. There are actually some pretty neat things to like about this card as far as the decision tree goes. If you run out all of the cards in your hand in the process of getting to cast Invocations, then the second mode is spectacularly free as far as your first choice goes, and if you need to win by either mill or by pushing 7 damage over the top, you can deliberately pick around those modes depending on which you need in order to guarantee a win. If you can either get a big mill effect into play before the Invocations or drop your opponent low enough, this is 6 mana to win the game outright. Witching Hour could kind of get halfway there on the life total by setting them to 13, so you just need to push 6 damage alongside Invocations. But my favorite pairing is to put Invocations alongside Post-Weft Psionic, where your opponent gets decked out on their upkeep by these 6 lands you tapped to cast Invocations. this starts to come together as a real deal win condition, which is kind of funny. Moving on to red, we're going to start with a 1-mana creature like we always do. Absolutely. Pay no mind to that type line. It's a 1-1, Steel Soul Ignition is a 1-1 construct artifact creature that gives a creature +1/+0 and haste when it enters. Except I'm obviously lying. It's not a creature at all. It's a sorcery. It makes a construct token and gives something +1/+0 when you make that token. I'm calling it as I see it, but there is nothing better for prowess decks than a 1-mana threat that isn't a creature but is still a creature on the board. So it's a 1-mana 2/1 at its baseline with haste that triggers prowess. Or it's a 1/1 that gives your prowess creature you just played out +1 power and haste later into the game. There are uses for it beyond just prowess. Artifact aggro is, of course, being pushed in this set, and it's a pretty spectacular 1-drop for that plan. It's great at token strategies when you play it turn 2 after playing a Kitsune Matriarch. It does the whole thing with the, I'm blanking on it right off the top of my head, but the 1-mana 1/1 coalition creature that wants to be attacking alongside a token immediately. This can enable it to scale on turn 2. It's, I think, the only way we have now to do so. This is just the best riff on Expedite I think we have ever gotten. I would gladly take a 1/1 that could get the +1 power and haste over a card draw in a lot of scenarios. Might be the best Expedite variant we ever get. Okay, now on to an actual creature. Ashen Ravager is a 1/1 wolf for 1 that gets a +1/+1 counter at your end step if the Void called you this turn, and has a death trigger to deal 3 damage to target player if its power was 3 or greater. That scaling ability is a bit sluggish. It's very hard to get to swing in with this for 2 the first time you're able to, at least in the early turns of the game, but I think this is a huge boon for Embers of a New Moon's playability. I stand by my previous assessment that Embers is one of the best draw spells we've got in red right now, and the thing holding it back from reigning supreme is just that we have a lack of competitive cheap wolves and werewolves. Ravager doesn't look super competitive, but you don't need to rely on its built-in scaling for the death trigger to put in work. And when we've still got Face of Animosity for 2 more seasons, I think this trio will be able to put in work together. Or Curse Ruminant is a 1-mana 1/1 construct artifact creature with haste, and a death trigger allowing you to rummage a card away. This is tragically our best option to replace Ignited Soul in looters decks, which I think just means looters don't want to look at 1-drops to glue their game plans together anymore. Flame Rush is a 1-mana instant that deals 2 damage divided as you choose among 1 or 2 target creatures. Blade Flourish is the 2nd most played Valir card right now, and the 12th most played non-land card in rotation. All for good reason. A shock that sometimes gets to split its damage between 1 toughness creature and your opponent is a big deal for pushing more damage up to the opponent. Flame Rush is a potent alternative, though, because while you can't use this to push damage to the opponent, it can do a better job at cleaning up the board, since you can 2-for-1 your opponent by picking off 2 1-toughness creatures for a single mana. This really preys upon token decks and other strategies with small creatures effectively, and I've got to imagine it'll just be a mainstay in the 75 of just about any red deck. Neon Dreams is 1 mana for a sorcery that requires you to discard a card as an additional cost to cast, exiling the top 2 cards of your library and allowing you to play them that turn. It's a very aggro-slanted card and feels particularly poised for self-discard strategies where that additional cost can be a benefit, enabling Call the Void synergies like Ashen Ravager, other discard synergies like Nilemonger. The one big trick here is that it demands your curve to be spectacularly low so as to get the use out of both cards you exile, since you only get 1 turn with them. It's kind of reminiscent of Magmatic Insight from Cannon Play, which was a fairly strong card, but that drew the cards outright, unlike Neon Dreams. The flexibility to pitch anything to Neon Dreams does make it look better. I think if you can keep your curve low and you play this before playing your land drop, it's a good amount of draw power for 1 mana. Ichor Winnower is a 2-mana 2/2 Eldrazi Cleric with Devoid and First Strike, and a triggered ability that nods to the canon card Void Winnower. Whenever an opponent casts a spell with an even mana value while it's in play, it deals 1 damage to that player, meaning that your opponent might get thrown off from their curve if they're trying to avoid taking damage from this. Now, the incidental damage can be nice for red burn and aggro decks that have this in their toolkit, but the 2-drop slot in red deck wins is kind of crowded between Cash Thrasher and Rozon Firebrand both being absolutely stellar, and both of which have haste compared to the Winnower. The advantage for Winnower is that it's the best defensive creature of the 3, because it retains its First Strike outside of your turn, unlike the Thrasher. As a result, I feel like it might be best positioned for red decks that are okay with going to the longer turns of the game, where Firebrand would fizzle out and Thrasher's draw power would be wasted when you're not swinging it in. Where there's more time for your opponent to be casting even mana value spells and taking incidental damage from the Ichor Winnower. I want to take this moment to shout out a particular partner in crime for Void Winnower, that being Marl Vikuro Head. She's always itching for things that do repeated damage, and Winnower effectively dealing 3 first strike damage, or shocking the opponent for each even mana value spell they have, closes out the game a lot faster. Marl's a powerful card that has really struggled to find her footing in the format so far, and she is suffering because she really appreciated the existence of 1-mana looters. So Winnower might be a way to help get her back on her feet. Bloodbone Pietist is a 2-mana 2/2 human warlock that mills you for 1 whenever it deals combat damage to a player, allowing you to play that card for the turn. It's also got a 3-mana activated ability, asking you to discard a card to give it +2/+2 for the turn and prevent a creature from blocking it this turn. So it calls the Void when it deals combat damage to a player, it calls the Void when you activate it. It's great, right? I've seen some murmurs about it being a potential powerhouse, and I'll be honest, I have no idea what you people are talking about. It's a 2/2. If it can't connect to the opponent, it just sits in play and doesn't get to get you advantage. And while you could use the activated ability to make it more likely to connect, it only prevents 1 creature from blocking it, so it does nothing to help the rest of your board get through because it only prevents the creature from blocking the Pietist. And 3 mana to activate means you probably aren't going to have enough mana left to play whatever it mills. It's just too dependent on things going very right for me to be even remotely confident in this, unfortunately. Preemption Engineer is a curious one. It's a 2/2 Elf Artificer 4/2 with first strike on your turn and the ability to give another one of your artifact creatures +2/+0 and first strike until end of turn by tapping this at the start of combat. It does a lot to help your smaller creatures safely attack into your opponent, and being able to do so the turn you play it helps circumvent the summoning sickness here to almost make it look reminiscent of Cash Thrasher. I might look underwhelming at first, but I think this could be a huge player in artifact aggro shells, where your Steel Soul Ignition tokens and High-Forged Overseers can get clear attacks into the opposing board in the mid-turn of the game, and help your go-wide strategy go a bit tall as well. Cavalesk's Reshapen is a 2/2 zombie soldier for 2 with haste, and it can be copied as you cast it by paying an additional 2 mana and discarding a card. For all the praise I heaped onto Screeching Portent, I'm hesitant to do the same for Cavalesk's Reshapen, because I mentioned that red really doesn't need the extra discard effects. Having the flexibility on this is nice. It being hasty is nice. Portent has advantages to being a discard effect that black only has so many defensive ways of leaning on in a way that red really doesn't care about. Eye-Kissed Invoker is a pretty simple creature, a 2-mana 2/1 human warlock with menace, and a 1-mana sacrifice ability that lets you convert it into 2 direct damage if the Void called you that turn. Probably not quite to the bar of competitive play, but it's an evasive attacker with built-in reach over the top, so I'm open to this one surprising me. Steelsuit Consultant is a 2-mana 2/2 Orc Artificer with haste that deals 1 damage to target player whenever 1 or more artifacts you control enter. We haven't had an effect like this since Arms Dealer rotated out with Viridian's Last Emission, and while it's missing some of the best treasure token generators we have in Nylon, since those are heading out the door, there's still some fairly strong treasure makers like Omen Skulker and Gatander Wildlander kicking around. It's a definite combo piece to keep an eye out for if ways to spit out endless artifacts ever crop up. Just be aware that this deals 1 damage no matter how many artifacts are entering, as long as they're all entering at once. So you really do want many individual artifacts to be made or put into play, rather than putting a bunch into play all at one time. A World Worth Fighting For is 1 in a red for an enchantment that checks for your first creature spell and first non-creature spell each turn, getting a heart counter or soul counter respectively. You can remove 1 heart and 1 soul counter as an activation to exile the top card of your library and play it that turn. I think this is a card with a ton of potential. Solid for prowess and spellslinger decks where they're liable to have a very low curve and reliably hit the requirements to keep this engine going. Solid for contest coordinator decks where this is more easily found and built around. Solid for flash shells where they might be able to get 2 cards per turn cycle later into the game and have reasons to double spell each turn. It's just a very high output draw engine when built around, and has a high likelihood of juicing up several low curve strategies in its colors, while also spawning archetypes Red hasn't previously gotten to dip into. Careening Steam Engine is a 2-mana artifact that deals 1 damage to each creature you don't control. You can also pay 2 mana and tap it to give a creature you control +1/+0 and trample until end of turn as a sorcery. This is primarily relevant as an alternative to Impromptu Exit, which is more efficient than the Steam Engine. So the primary reason to look at the Careening Steam Engine is if you're on artifact synergies. If you can blink artifacts, if you can sacrifice artifacts, if you just want to have artifacts in play, the Steam Engine might have some real merits in place of Impromptu Exit. But the Exit is going to be the more efficient card in every case. Jettison is pretty innocuous as a modal sorcery. 2 mana to either destroy an artifact or have a creature you control deal damage equal to its power before it sacrifices. Shatter or Fling, what's the big deal, right? Well, we've got 2 other Fling-like effects right now between Fall Upon Your Blade and Instill Absolution, as well as 3 different creatures that can shoot the opponent for a ton of damage when they die if they get big enough. That third one is in the multicolor section. We'll get to it when we get to black-red cards. Suffice it to say, there's a lot of things going in favor of black-red Fling right now, and this is a piece of that puzzle, of course. Forge and Anguish is a 2-mana combat trick requiring you to discard a card or pay an additional 1 to cast it, and which gives a creature you control +3/+1 for strike and trample until end of turn. This is undoubtedly nowhere near as good as Face of Animosity, because you don't retain any of the stats and it costs twice as much to cast and you have to discard a card to cast it. But the first strike is admittedly really enticing for this to really turn combat math around in your favor. I think if you're looking for a trick without sacrificing synergy slots in a discard deck, this could be the big winner. It does help the Void call you. Deathscorn Apostle is a 3-mana 3/2 human cleric with Menace and an attack trigger that allows you to draw a card at the cost of needing to discard 2 cards at your next end step. For all my doubting of Bloodbone Pietist's potential, despite people hyping it up, I think y'all are sleeping on Deathscorn Apostle. I have seen very little chatter about this, but it looks like it has some real merit in an aggressive shell, since those decks are most likely to start running out of cards in hand, at which point you can swing in with the Apostle, take the draw, and there's very little downside, because you just can play that spell and discard the 0 cards left in your hand at your end step. And that's just assuming the discard's a downside, because we know well by now that discard can be abused as well. I think Apostle is being appreciated. The combination of Menace and repeat value generation makes this something quite special, and I think this will absolutely put in work and be the removal magnet that it absolutely should be. Tormented Eulogist is kinda gimmicky, but kinda neat. It's a 3-mana 0/3 with haste and an attack trigger to set its base power to the amount of mana you spent to cast spells in the turn. My initial inclination was that this might be a cute mid-range threat since it can push more damage over time, but the 3 toughness and non-existent blocking potential kill that notion. Where my mind has instead landed is combo. If you can set up some Storm-like chain casting spell after spell after spell and get some of those spells to generate mana, either intrinsically or by casting treasures, then you can suddenly enter a strange game where if you spend as much mana as your opponent has health the turn that you play the Eulogist, it kills them. Naturally, there's 2 big issues in opposing blockers and opposing interaction, but any way to silence your opponent and any way to give Eulogist trample solve each of those problems, resulting in this looking like a very real eternal kill condition. If you like Storm decks, keep an eye on this for eternal play. Ritual Archivist is a 3-mana 3/2 human advisor with first strike on your turn and a triggered ability to give you a single red mana the first time the Void calls you each turn, with that mana persisting through steps and phases in case you get it during combat or at the start of your turn. I want to like Archivist, and 3/2 first striker is a reasonably safe attacker, but I think it's just too awkward of a hoop to get the mana compared to something like Thoroughfare Busker, which already really doesn't see any play. The killer for me here is that if you've already had the Void call you the turn that you play it, it cannot trigger for that turn. So it starts to present weird scenarios where you want to play this into another spell, but by doing the thing your deck is designed to do, you'll already have called the Void before Archivist hits the field, and as a result, you just don't get the extra mana from Archivist. It's not an awful card, but I just don't think it's up to par. The same can be said of Innovation Thief. It's a 3/2 rogue for 3 that makes your next non-creature spell cost 1 less to cast whenever it attacks, which is just worse than making a mana to pay for casting that spell, so probably not primed to see play. This, however, is a 3-mana card that makes mana, which I can get behind. The West District Hanger is a legendary artifact that can tap for 2 red mana that can't be spent to cast non-artifact spells, and amplifies damage your sources would deal to opponents and their permanents by 2, as long as you have 4 uniquely named artifacts in play, or more. This is great as a top-end piece for artifact aggro, provided that deck can reliably get enough unique artifacts into play, which seems like that's a usually answer. But it also just seems like a solidly annoying mana rock for any red deck jamming artifacts. The mana can obviously be spent to cast all of our best artifacts, but it's not just limited to artifact spells. You can use this to crack clues and charts, equip any equipment that you have lying around, activate any creature abilities, any utility abilities on lands. You can pay for a quench attempting to stop one of your spells. Any 3-mana rock that taps for 2 is going to be worthy of attention, and I think this one is capable of proving itself worthy. In Eldritch Flame is another 3-mana deal 2 to all creatures effect and instant speed, but it might be a real consideration for the slot compared to some of its competition. Once it's cast, it sets up a 1-turn replacement effect, causing opponents' creatures that would die to get exiled instead. It does some serious work to offset any graveyard-centric decks like Aristocrats by not only clearing their progress, but denying them all of their Blood Artist triggers and their recursion effects. The replacement effect is also a one-sided one, so there's no downside to including it in your decks that might care about these things. Occupation is the threaten effect of the set, costing 2 and a red for a sorcery that steals an artifact or creature for the turn, untaps it, and gives it haste. However, if you're taking a non-creature artifact with it, it becomes a creature, with mana value setting its power and toughness. Normally, I wouldn't pay too much attention to a 3-mana threaten, but being able to use this on your own artifacts to animate them, or on opposing artifacts to feed them to your creature sacrifice effects, is pretty neat. I don't think we have any especially relevant effects to animate with this right now, but it's a handy effect to have. Bender of Will is our first red Mythos Eldrazi, a 3/3 for 3, and a colorless with a trigger that fires whenever a player casts a spell with a single other creature as the target, giving you the option to copy that spell and have it target the Bender. Its Mythos sorcery is Unending Pain, 1 and a red to give target creature double strike until end of turn. Most of the single target spells your opponents are likely to cast are removal, so I doubt you really want to copy those, meaning this is really just something to double up your own heroic triggers, effectively, your spells that would get heroic triggers. I don't think Face of Animosity is so powerful as to justify a 4-mana 3/3 so your Face of Animosities can cast twice, and not even get to target the same creature twice. Just kind of unfortunate. Crimson Gladeguard is a 4-mana 3/4 beast warlock with trample and a trigger to get +1/+0 until end of turn whenever you discard a card. It's mostly just in the review to shout it out as a weird combo potential option for pauper play, where it represents a potential kill if you can discard enough cards in a turn. Very Moonlight Adversary-esque in that way, though so unbelievably far from the adversary when it comes to proper constructed play. Blinding Immolation is a 4-mana instant that deals 5 damage to target creature, and it costs 2 less to cast if the Void called you in the turn. It's another cost-reducing 4-mana value removal spell, and this time in the right colors for all the relevant payoffs. It's especially relevant that discarding a card calls the Void, because that means if you discard Shroudward of Phoenix, you enable Blinding Immolation's discount to get back the Phoenix at combat. Kraz Head Engineer is a legendary 4/4 Goblin Artificer for 3 and double red that gives your artifact creatures haste and has a triggered ability to create a 0/0 construct with +1/+1 for each of your artifacts when he enters and at your upkeep, but with the caveat that this token is sacrificed at the next end step. It seems like it could be a decent top-end card for the artifact aggro shell. And for really any red aggro plan, though at 5 mana, it really needs to be the key to crossing the finish line. And with these tokens not gaining trample or any form of evasion, while this is a potential inevitability engine, it might just require too much work to make it reliably threatening. Somehow there is yet another interesting combo-leaning card kicking around in red here, this time up at 5 mana. Brazen Sootbellow is a 5-mana 3/3 dragon artifact creature with flying, haste, and an attack trigger to spit out a treasure, as well as a fire-breathing ability that can either be activated for a single red mana if you like you'd expect it to, or by tapping an untapped artifact you control. So here's another kill from hand card, this time dependent on you having built up enough untapped artifacts to equal your opponent's health -4, since you can count the first 3 points of power and the treasure it makes on attack. Like with the other combo payoff cards I've talked about this section, I'm not sure we have the right pieces in rotation, but this is yet another card with a crazy high ceiling if we can find the right engine to make it a one-shot win. Iron Triumphant's a far less flashy artifact creature, but it might still be pretty good. It's 4 and a red for a 4/4 construct that costs 2 less to cast if you control 2 or more artifacts. 3 mana 4/4 is a stat line you typically only get to see in green, and in a deck like Artifact Aggro, where you're likely to have a cheap suite of artifact creatures and artifact token generators, and even Headstone's a 0 mana artifact in its own right, this could be a 3-drop fairly consistently. It's hard to say if the artifact decks will want a vanilla 4/4, but a solid stat line on a 3-drop is nice, and this is frequently a 3-drop when you put it into your deck. I misremembered in mentioning that Beck and the Beyond was something I remembered today. I remembered it last night when scripting the red and green cards, because I mentioned it here. Mantle Breacher is our second red Mythos Eldrazi, this one being a 6/4 with Trample for 5 and a colorless with a 2-mana fire-breathing ability. Frankly, the only real thing this has going for it is its Mythos sorcery, Tear Earth. 1 and a red to give your creatures +1/+0 and haste until end of turn. Now, we do have a mass haste granter right now, and it's very high impact as one because it's attached to an arc trail. But that being said, Advance of Fire and Faith requires the additional work of dealing 3 damage to it in order for it to give your creatures haste, and Terror Earth has no such issue. What's more, this is my first opportunity was supposed to be the first opportunity to talk about Beck and the Beyond getting a big buff. It can grab Mantle Breach from your sideboard, meaning that if you need something that gives your entire board haste, you don't have to include it in your deck. You can run Beck and the Beyond and find it with find Mantle Breacher when you need it, and otherwise not come up your deck with awkward Eldrazi. So yeah, I forgot that I've remembered Beck and the Beyond here and not later in the review. It's a mess. I'm tired. I've been at this pretty much nonstop for several days in terms of scripting, and now recording has been several hours. Anyways, our last red card is our third red Mythos Eldrazi. It's a 7/7 for 5 and double colorless with trample and a trigger whenever you spend 7 or more mana to cast a spell for it to bolt target player. Its Mythos sorcery is Anoint in Fire, X and a red to deal X damage to any non-player target. We've got some Banefires to compete with this. It doesn't get to go to the opponent like Olivia's Debauchery or sometimes Malignant Moonbeam, but I mean, like, this is one that can shoot your battles, I guess. I think you only really care about it if you're on Beck and the Beyond and you just want some, like, X spell for removal in your sideboard, but then you're spending 3 mana to get it with Beckon. I don't know. On to green, and we're starting with a very lovely sight to see. Wreckage Inquisitors is a green 3-man inspector. More of a green novice inspector, since that's the one that it actually matches subtypes with. But it's a great start to any green deck's curve. It's a 1/2 human detective, investigates when it enters. Any green grindy strategies will just be happy to have a 1-drop that eventually replaces itself, and as we'll get to soon, there are plenty of incentives for stompy decks to keep building up clue tokens as well, so this is a pretty all-around great green card. Eccentric Geneticist is a scaling 1-drop threat like we have never seen before. It's a 1-mana 1/1 human scientist with 3 passive buffs for itself, checking for you to have creatures with at least a mana value of 2, 4, and 6 respectively. The first threshold just makes it a 2/2, so if you curve a 2-mana creature out after a turn 1 Geneticist, this is attacking for 2 that turn. Once you get up to having a 4-drop in play, it's a 3/3 with Vigilance, making it reliably able to attack while ensuring the opponent struggles to do the same. With a 6-drop in play, or with anything bigger, it ends up being a 4/4 with Vigilance and Trample, all for 1 mana. Now, the big point of contention here is that unlike some of our other scaling threats we've had, this is entirely dependent on your opponent not removing your bigger creatures, which is, of course, something they're normally incentivized to do anyhow. The end result is that Geneticist snowballs the game hard in your favor when your opponent can't stop what you're up to, and winds up looking kind of limp when the opponent does draw their removal. It's scary, it's splashy, and it might look better than it actually plays. Donnybrook is a 1-mana sorcery fight spell that creates a clue after the fact. It's a pretty great removal spell by green standards, and getting to draw a card off of your efficient removal spell is a stellar deal to be taking. Momentous Strike is probably the better removal spell overall, but if you have any reasons to care about clues, this is a very reasonable include. Ancient Stirrings is back in rotation. We haven't had it since the end of Season 5, and it's fitting that we last had it on the other Revolution plane that was besieged by Eldrazi, Gareve. This is a great incentive to lean towards colorless cards and synergies, but it'll probably see very little play for its first season because A Journey Begins is still around, and that rotates out at the end of the year. Fortunately, Journey Begins tends to want a very, very different strategy than Ancient Stirrings, so unless all of your colorless cards are cheap artifacts and creatures, you're probably safe to reach for Stirrings over AJB. Rose Garden Conference is a 2-mana 3/2 human noble with a coalition trigger that lets you untap up to 1 target land you control, making it an XX green elemental for the turn, where X is the number of attacking tokens. You can then choose to re-tap it to have it be attacking, meaning you can accompany a wide board with a tall threat demanding the most immediate attention. It's certainly an appealing card on the surface, but for the amount of damage it's capable of outputting. But I can't help but be wary of this, since it's pretty underwhelming when you aren't pushing wide, and it's a bit on the frail side. It could be worth trying in green and white tokens, but I'm not entirely sure here. Strangely enough, I'm more optimistic about the 2-mana common with a coalition trigger. Callhem Plowdrivers is a 2/2 Ox with a Vigilance that gets +1/+1 in trample on any turn where it attacks alongside 1 or more tokens. Unlike Rose Court Conference, which is pretty reliant on you going very wide to have the most impact, this is as good with 1 attacking token as it is with 10. As a result, I'm more willing to argue that the floor here is just more appealing than what we've seen on the previous card. And while the ceiling isn't exactly high, it's a good enough 2-drop that I'm willing to give this one more credit. Game Hunters is another 2-mana 2/2, this time a human ranger that gets a +1/+1 counter the first time you sacrifice a permanent each turn. Any permanent means this gets free triggers when you play and crack a basic fetch like Primal Fisher, but also means any treasure, clue, chart tokens, they all grow the Game Hunters. It's reasonable enough for the early turn in a fair sacrifice deck, and in theory you can swing with it as a 4/4 the turn after you play it by starting with Sacrificial Lamb, sacrificing at the turn cycle you play out the Game Hunters, and sacrificing another thing on turn 3. Mutation Investigator is a new entry into the 2-mana Dork field. It's a 1/2 human scientist that taps for a green mana, or you can pay 1 and tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on a creature with 4 or more mana as a mana value 4 or greater as a sorcery. I'm not sure it really gets there over the dork options we have right now at 2. Sunsoaker, Dark Thicket Howler, and Concurrent Escapist all have defined niches where they perform rather well, and there are others beyond them that struggle to see play. I suspect Investigator will land similarly, especially since even the 4 mana value matters deck has a better 2-drop mana dork at its disposal. Voices in the Mist is X green for a 1/1 Eldrazi Hydra with Devoid, not Devout. What the? Why is my brain saying it says Devout? Devoid. Trample, and an enter trigger to put X +1/+1 counters on it. Once you do, you can sacrifice one of your other creatures to have the Hydra fight a creature you don't control, and that means that for a black-green sacrifice shell, this actually does a really good impression of something like Glitch Out, letting you push a bunch of mana into killing an opposing creature. But with Voices, it's attached to a body that'll usually be left behind after the fact, and a body which will demand an answer sometime soon because it's a big trampling body. It seems like a really solid creature, and I could see it making some waves in any green deck with disposable creatures and mana to spare. Rev up those Eldrazi Scions, I guess. Bitten by the Void is a 2-mana modal instant, letting either a creature you control deal damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control, or making you an Eldrazi Scion. I think maybe this gets tried out in Colorless Matters decks, and we do have one reason in green we'll get to soon to care about making an Eldrazi Scion to cast something on turn 3 specifically. But I'm not sure the flexibility here is enough for this to beat out any of the plethora other ways for green to get to cast a 4-drop on turn 3, between both permanent ramp, temporary ramp, and mana dorks. Cataclysm Constable is a 2/2 human detective for 2 with vigilance and a trigger to investigate whenever one or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player. That means if you can safely attack with the 1-drop you played the prior turn, your Wreckage Inquisitors for instance, this will investigate the turn you play it as well as every subsequent turn as you please. We're almost to the heart of the clues package, but this is absolutely a key player in that suite, and I think this could be a real draw engine for green stompy and mid-range shells. This is not the aforementioned Heart of the Clues shell, but it is a pretty great card, I think. Confidential Science is a 2-mana enchantment that draws you a card when it enters, and makes a clue whenever you cast a spell with mana value 4 or greater. Now, obviously, this is styled after the famously broken Up the Beanstalk, and while REV is lacking in many of the mechanics that broke Beanstalk in half, evoke an impending chief among them, and this doesn't outright draw you cards like the Beanstalk did, making clues instead opens the door to play into a number of other synergy avenues. The obvious home looks like it'd be some sort of Majesty shell, but I could see slower decks running the clue package reasonably getting away with including this as well, especially if they have ways to crack open their clues for less mana or no mana at all. Curious Botanist is a 3-mana 3/3 artifact creature construct with a modal enter and attack trigger, allowing you to choose between investigating, letting you play an additional land this turn, or gaining you 2 life. It's frankly just a strong self-contained 3-mana creature, getting you card draw or ramp when you need it, and gaining you life when you're desperate for it. Hard to know where for certain this fits into the format, but I'm definitely a fan. Also, something that occurs to me I meant to put in here, and it's not in the review, there is another 3-mana 3/3 artifact creature that makes clues. It's a 3/3 for 3 that makes a clue on enter in green, and it lets you put a land from your hand into play whenever you draw your second card in a turn. I think Curious Botanist is just better. Hence why I think it didn't make it into the review, but it's worth at least mentioning. I wish I had the image pulled up, but I don't want to mess around with everything so you can see the image. Just look through the card galleries, please, I beg of you. Deep Cover Prowler is a 3-mana 4/3 Eldrazi detective. Once again, not the Heart of the Clues package, I promise, we're almost there. With a triggered ability to investigate whenever a creature you control becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, though you actually just get to draw a card instead if you've already investigated in the turn. For 3 and a green, you can also fragment itself at its instant speed, meaning you can just get a second Deep Cover Prowler by fragmenting it with its own ability, guaranteeing targeted removal to both get you a clue and a card in hand immediately. This is a spectacular sustainability engine as far as green stompy goes, making up for the 3 toughness by way of ensuring your opponent's removal doesn't take you out of the game. We had a very similar effect like this that I did not think to put on screen, but a very similar effect like this that put in a lot of work back in the previous iteration of Investigate with Secrets of the River Cities. And I think Deep Cover Prowler will do that previous card, Jericho's Assistant, I believe, quite well. Formless Scape is a 3-mana land aura that investigates on enter and lets the enchanted land tap for an additional colorless whenever it makes mana. I like this more than I usually like these kinds of effects because the clue is a fine enough way to make up for this later on, and it helps you fix for your colorless spells. I don't think it'll see much play, but I do like it. A Hole in the Sky looks pretty rough on the surface. Broken Wings effects aren't usually all that playable, and having an Eldrazi in play isn't something that's looking to be so consistent that this gets the cost reduction from 3 down to 2. But there is a potential niche for it, solely in that Pick Your Poison is the only other thing to occupy this niche right now, and while I was anticipating it to be a major role player, it's just not consistent enough. There are enough disposable artifacts and enchantments to insulate the things you really care about, meaning it just falters against some of the things that you most want to be preying upon. A hole in the sky at least guarantees you pick off what you're most concerned about, and occasionally you will actually get to leverage the cost reduction clause here in some decks, so maybe it winds up getting some play. Holism Seeker. Holism Seeker is a 3-mana 1/2 human citizen that destroys an artifact or enchantment when it enters, and you can fragment it at instant speed by tapping it and paying 3 and a colorless. It's a very good utility creature, but while we still have Hungry Blob and Purifier of Dawnbloom Grove, I think they just push Holism Seeker out of contention. It has the most potential upside because it's a 2-for-1 later on into the game, but that really demands you be able to meet the colorless mana requirement, so that is a deck building cost the other two don't put as much demand on. Ruinate is one hell of a sideboard card. It's 1 and double green for a sorcery that destroys all non-creature, non-land permanents with mana value 3 or less. Gorian Leyspire has seen a lot of play and plays a similar role overall, but Ruinate has the benefit of being cheaper and even sniping a 3-mana Planeswalker on occasion, which is a pretty nice deal when we have 5 cheap legendary creatures that flip into Planeswalkers for the next 5 seasons. We have made it here at last. Gloamvale Trackers is a 4-mana 4/5 human dog detective with trample and 2 key triggered abilities. The first investigates whenever you cast your first creature spell each turn, unfortunately meaning the trackers cannot investigate the turn it's played. The second ability triggers the start of combat on your turn, turning every single one of your clues into a 3/3 artifact creature with trample that self-sacrifices when it deals combat damage to a player to draw you a card. This is the biggest reason to jam the clues package whatsoever, even more so than our Black Mythic. Yes, tutoring with your clues is great. Killing your opponent with clues and drawing more cards to kill your opponent with is even better. Whether you're just trading off your 3/3s with opposing creatures, which is card advantage in its own right, or connecting and drawing cards in that way, it just pushes so much card advantage and damage over time. It's also just a well-statted 4-drop in its own right that makes you clues in its own ability over multiple turns. So even without running an investigate package, this still does work on its lonesome. But because you can build around it, you can guarantee that you'll have like Wreckage Inquisitors, Deep Cover Prowler, maybe Cataclysm Constable, maybe Donnybrook, and just have so many opportunities to just have incidental clues kicking around for the trackers to turn into a ton of damage out of nowhere. Analytic Processor, not Professor, is maybe not that key to the clues plan, but it's still neat. It's a 4-mana 6/6 construct detective artifact creature with vigilance and reach, though it costs an additional 2 mana to cast unless you can sacrifice a clue instead. My best notion for where this could matter is in some sort of shell where we're cheating 4-mana creatures into play, but the only option we have for that is the Ancient Master, which is not the cheating card we're looking for. There are some more options in Eternal, but there are also way better 4-drops to cheat into play in Eternal, so I'm not sure it gets much better there. Astrum Weaver is our first green Mythos Eldrazi. It's a 4/2 Eldrazi spider for 3 and a colorless with flash, reach, and a trigger at the beginning of each end step to put a +1/+1 counter on each of your creatures if you spent mana from a Scion this turn. Its Mythos sorcery is Grizzly Bloom, which for 5 and a green creates 3 Eldrazi Scion tokens. I still am somewhat of a naysayer on Bitten by the Void, but this is the use case I can think of. Bitten's Scion token mode is one of only 2 different 2-mana cards in the set that we are guaranteed to have curve into Astrum Weaver the following turn by sacrificing a Scion to do so. The other one is a lot more playable. We'll get to it in the multicolor section. And because both Bitten by the Void and Astrum Weaver can be played at instant speed, you can just cast Astrum Weaver for a functional 5 mana by casting Bitten by the Void first on your opponent's second main phase if you so desire. Weaver is one of our best excuses to push hard into Scion token generation, so if you're itching to make a bunch, this is why you care. Did I mention Grizzly? I mentioned Grizzly Bloom. Unfortunately, this doesn't work positively with the Eldrazi mana-making tokens from Gareve in Eternal, since those are Eldrazi spawn tokens. So this probably won't make any waves in Eternal play. It's pretty much standard or bust. Gene Recombinators is a 4-mana 4/4 human scientist with a 1-mana activated ability that lets you sacrifice 2 creatures as a sorcery, combining their power to form both the power and toughness of a green ooze token. It also has a coalition trigger to copy up a token you control. This can copy non-creature tokens, so you don't have to copy up the oozes this makes. So I see very little reason not to do that, but you could. It's an intriguing top-end card for a black-green sacrifice shell, since the strategy is likely to want to look at recursive creatures like Catabolist, which are naturally slanted towards having high power and making tokens in their own right. Stronger oozes when fed to the Recombinators. It can also just sacrifice itself in a pinch if a 4/4 and whatever second creature you have just aren't individually cutting it against the opponent's board. It's a neat uncommon, and I'd be curious to see if it gets any reps. If last season's many changes to Harvest-Tide Procession teach any lessons, it's that copying up tokens on a token-making engine is pretty strong. Eldritch Growth is somehow our only proper explosive vegetation effect in rotation right now. It's 3 and a green as a sorcery, searches up 2 basic lands to play untapped, all to be expected, but then it untaps each waste you put into play this way. I'm not well versed enough in the archetype to know, so definitely turn to the experts on this one, but I feel like this could actually be a candidate for eternal play in the green colorless ramp shells built around the source. Having wastes in that deck that wants to make their lands into wastes might be awkward, but refunding 2 mana off of Eldritch Growth is pretty great when you get the opportunity to do so, to the point where I think it could be worth having a shot both in green colorless Tron in Eternal and in standard ramp shells. Technically, there is a second 4-mana green spell that can immediately refund you 2 colorless mana. Straightway Incursion either makes you 2 Eldrazi Scions or puts a +1/+1 counter on each of your creatures, but I don't think either mode is really worth the rate in constructed play, even if the 2 Scions would be probably 2 above rate at 3 mana. I'm just not expecting much from this. If you're really desperate for all the Eldrazi Scions you can put into play, this might be something. Awoken Cordillera is a 5-mana 6/6 Eldrazi with Devoid and Trample, as well as a death trigger to return it to play tapped and face down. While it's face down, it's a land that taps for 2 colorless mana and has a triggered ability to tap itself once again while turning face up when you spend your 7th total mana to cast spells in a turn. This feels to me like a generically sweet top-end threat for Stompy, though it places a deck-building demand on maybe having some X-cost spells there to feasibly spend 7 mana in a turn reliably later into the game. And if you're casting this at 5 and it dies, you'll have 7 mana even without making another land drop, so it can help make the 7th mana on spells happen. There's also some shenanigans we can do with this, of course. Laybound Ritualist has this come back untapped, so you can immediately tap it for 2 colorless mana. We've got land flickers like Brief Stop that can also take advantage of this just hiding in the mana base, so you can Brief Stop it as an ambush spell on defense to bring the 6/6 back as a blocker. I've been thinking about the reworked Birthing Pod-esque version of Portal to the Spirit Realm, and with both that and the Cordillera being targetable by Brief Stop, maybe green-white pods on the menu for next season. Scapebender is our last green Mythos Eldrazi, a 7-mana 7/7 with Trample that gets 3+1/+1 counters when you spend 7 or more mana to cast a spell. Oh boy, can you tell this was very late at night that I was scripting this? The +3/+3 just got me. The Mythos sorcery is Pierce Infinity. Casts for X and a green, puts X +1/+1 counters on target creature. It's a big pump spell for Beck and the Beyond, but probably not relevant. It's not our last Mythos spell of green, though. Bark Splitter Colossus is the last of our mono green cards, and it's the second Mythos creature that isn't colorless. It's an 8/8 elemental horror for 8 with Trample and an enter trigger to gain you 3 life. Its Mythos sorcery is Winding Roots. 1 and a green, surveil 1, gain 3 life. That's pretty mediocre for constructed play, but this is here for future pauper speculation for the most part, where this is a reanimation target that can bin itself by playing the Mythos from hand. It won't be relevant for a while, but never say never. Burn looks really good in pauper, and having a reanimation target that gains you life is good. It feels weird to be wrapping things up with multicolor cards rather than still having another section to go, but so is the nature of a colorless focused set. Anyways, there are no multicolor cards that are more than 2 colors, and no hybrid cards in Goldport, so we're just going to go in color pair order, starting with Blacksite Enhancer in white-blue. It's a 2/3 human scientist for 1 a white and a blue that can be cast as though it had flash if you spend a colorless mana for that generic cost. From there, it's got Vigilance and extends that flash granting effect to any of your other spells that you spend colorless on. This could be a neat piece for tempo or control leaning white-blue colorless shells, allowing you to do more with your floating mana when you don't spend it on counterspells. It's a tad awkward that the only innately colorless spell that looks to be viable for such a strategy already has flash, but that just means you aren't dependent on the enhancer to make Arbiter worthwhile. And you can focus on the enhancer's ability, letting your other spells have flash. Ulmin Triune Liaison is a 4-mana 3/4 legendary human advisor with a triggered ability that fires off each time you cast a spell for at least 1 colorless mana, drawing you a card at a minimum, and then copying the spell in its entirety if you spent at least 3 colorless on it. I think this is one of our big primary incentives to actually build around a colorless matters mana base, because having each of your removal spells or counter spells, cantrip in addition to their normal effects is due to bury the opponent in no time. I'm perhaps more enticed by their combo potential, where they offer the ability to chain any and every 1 mana artifact so long as you have a way to keep getting colorless mana each time. And not to get ahead of ourselves, but there is an Eldrazi in the blue-red section that makes an Eldrazi Scion whenever you cast a non-creature spell, so there's a natural pairing for combo purposes as well. Whether you're playing them fairly or not, Ulmin is a hell of a colorless payoff for a spell that costs no colorless mana to cast. The colorless incentives don't stop coming, though. Subsume Reality is a 4-mana modal instant, allowing you to either put target spell or non-land permanent onto the top of its owner's library, third from the top, or look at the top 3 cards of your library, putting 1 into the hand, 1 on the back on the top of your deck, and the rest on the bottom in a random order. Actually up to 1 on the top of your deck. You can put none on the top if you just want to get rid of the rest. If you spend at least 1 colorless mana to cast this, you can choose both modes if you are so inclined, allowing you to have flexible counter spells and removal spells that replace themselves when you play it. It's another solid control tool for white-blue colorless in Constructed, but I also want to take this opportunity to shout out potential Eternal applications for the colorless package. Eternal Play has our single best colorless incentive. My god, words are failing me. It's been such a long video. We're almost through. Eternal Play has our single best colorless incentive in the format's history, that being Ziv Repla Sparked, as well as some of our best colorless fixing tools between Luxurious Estate and Ice Path. This colorless support paving the way for more real control shells in Eternal would be a very pleasant surprise. Here we are at last, at the one and only Planeswalker of Stirrings in Goldport. Xyla, Her Will Be Done, is a 4 white and blue, 5 loyalty Planeswalker with a passive triggered ability and 3 loyalty abilities. Her passive allows you to fragment any non-token creature you control when they enter, extracting twice as much value out of any enter-trigger-centric creature you might be inclined to run. Her +1 draws you a card and adds 2 colorless mana, meaning you can immediately follow Xyla up with a 2-mana colorless card, or any 2 and a color spell if you play her out with 1 mana to spare. Her -2 deals damage to target creature equal to the number of creatures you control, and her -7 draws you 3 cards before creating an emblem that makes your creatures 4/4 Eldrazi Angels with flying. Now, beyond the obvious point of interest in that Xyla is spectacular with Conscious Coordinator, it's one final Planeswalker to try and slip into play on turn 3 off the back of Shigane Manor Burns into Dark Horse Victory before DHV rotates at the end of the year. It's also a Planeswalker that looks pretty perfect when paired with the Founder's Cage, since her uptick allows you to play it if you haven't already, and the cage helps you get to the point of casting her otherwise. And if you can uptick her and then untap the next turn without her losing any loyalty, you can just use the cage to get her to her 7th loyalty and ult her the turn after you play her. With this being DHV's sunset season, I definitely want to give that card one last fair shake, and Xyla looks to be one hell of a final target for it. On to blue and black, starting with Essence Ripper. It's a 3-mana 2/4 human warlock that exiles the top 2 cards of your library of each player's library face down when it enters. You can look at the cards while they remain exiled, and you can pay a black only and discard a card as a sorcery to gain access to a card exiled with the Ripper for the turn. This is never exactly card advantage more than it is card selection, since you only ever get one of the exiled cards by pitching one of the ones in your hand. But as always, you can build around discarding cards when you put this into your deck, and you need look no further than the recently rotated Callisto the Tachyarch and Data Weaver to know that theft effects have a bit of a stained reputation in Revolution as of late, particularly when they're actually competitive, and this certainly does have the makings of doing something similar. The thing keeping it looking reasonable, though, really just come down to the cost to activate, because it not only limits the proper card advantage you can extract, but also sneakily taxes all of the spells you're getting by 1 black mana, so even a cheap draw spell isn't as cheap as you'd want it to be. Psychic Rupture is a 4-mana draw spell that's lying to you about it being a draw spell. It's a sorcery that has you draw 2 cards before having each player discard 2 cards. Awesome if you care about filling your graveyard and having things in your hand that don't want to stay there. And provided your opponent has 2 cards to discard, it is still technically card advantage. But I don't think Mind Rot with a careful study stapled to it is something you're gonna be desperate for by any measure. With Memoriam still around and kicking, blue-black decks have a great card advantage tool worth reaching for that's more flexible than Rupture and gets you to reuse removal spells rather than try to dig for them. So I think you'll probably be more inclined to dedicate plans towards the Memoriam over the Rupture. Greytide Spectre is insane. It's 3 a blue and a black for a 4/4 Devoid Eldrazi Spectre with flying and 1 hell of a cast trigger. When you cast it, you return any number of target non-land... Sorry, not even target. Return any number of non-land cards from your graveyard to your hand. And then you discard that many cards. Meaning if you have incentives to discard a bunch of cards, like, say, I don't know, Moonlight Adversary or Feasting Ceremony, you can pick up every last non-land card in your graveyard, and then deal damage to your opponent for each one of those cards. This is a spectacular 1-2 punch with Adversary, especially if you still have mana to spare after the Spectre, since you can just play out an Adversary and pay a bunch of life to rebuy several of the cards you discarded if the Adversary wouldn't have killed your opponent beforehand. 5 mana can be a bit awkward to rely on, but there are so many ways to rummage and loot away cards turn after turn to help fuel the Spectre, and great things to be doing in the meantime, so this could be a very real kill condition for a blue-black or Grixis discard deck. On to Black-Red, we've got Malformed Initiate. It's a 2-mana 1/1 Horror Warlock with an upkeep trigger that allows you to pay 1 black or red mana and discard a card to put a +1/+1 counter on it and give it menace for the turn, as well as a death trigger to deal damage equal to its power to anything when it dies, as implied by it being a death trigger. This is that last scaling threat that works with fling effects I mentioned earlier, and while it's a bit sluggish to scale up, it still works great with any pump spell like Face of Animosity, and it's got a relevant set of type lines for Matriarch of Veiledkin, something that's been true for some of the other creatures in the set, but more relevant when you might actually care about the Anthem. It might struggle to fully slot into the Fling Shell, but it's a nice bit of added density in case you care. Xander Half Forgotten is a 3-mana 2/2 legendary human warlock with Menace, and an end-step trigger to make a 2/1 warlock token if the Void called you that turn. We may be losing Ignited Soul, but we still have so many good red cards that care about discarding cards, and this is a nice way to diversify your threat base in those shells. He's a bit fragile to small sweepers, but then so is any card that's going to be pushing wide, and the nice part of Xander is that if your opponent does hit him and his warlock tokens with a small sweeper, that was only one actual card invested to build that board, so it's not some critical loss. I think that's a very solid 3-drop, and we will likely see him put in some work. Obsessive Ritualist is a 3-mana 2/3 human warlock that allows you to have each player discard a card when it enters, getting +1/+1, Death Touch, and Haste on any turn where the Void has called you. It's a pretty awesome Unearth target that can set up a subsequent target for your next Unearth, only really held back by 2 factors. We don't really have any good 1-mana ways to discard this for a turn 2 Unearth, and the best ways to unearth it include March of the Long Night, where it gives Death Touch and Haste, which are 2 unnecessary keywords to be gaining here, given its passive to be a 3/4. I wonder if this actually just doesn't care about the Unearth's plan at all. It's just best treated as a decently aggressive 3-drop for Void Call strategies. Those decks could maybe still get away with Become the Hunted, since it's an Unearth you could safely discard or surveil over. But as far as getting to Unearth something on turn 2 goes, your only real bet is to surveil something on turn 1 and just cross your fingers. Cavalesk the Dark Exalted is our third and final non-Eldrazi Mythos card. They're a 4-mana 4/3 legendary zombie warlock that allows you to exile a card whenever it enters your graveyard from your hand or library, giving you the opportunity to play it that turn. Their Mythos sorcery is Glimpse the Eye, which is 1 and a red to discard up to 3 cards and then draw that many. We've got a couple other versions of this sort of effect between Valiant Firebrand and Cordelia Stromkirk, so Cavalesk doesn't have an easy place to slot in next to those. But having a built-in way to discard 3 cards at once is pretty nice for trying to get a bunch of value in one shot. These effects do play nicely with a couple niche build rounds where Cavalesk's trigger yields a bunch of individual tokens off of a Yeshi's Agent or Blightseer, but I don't think those plans have really panned out yet, and my hopes for changing that aren't exactly high. Restless Summoners is a red and a green for a 2/3 zombie warlock that taps for colorless or 1 mana of any color. It untaps itself whenever you cast a spell with mana value 6 or greater. The obvious point of comparison initially is Melodious Mallard, which trades out untapping for caring about spells with lower mana value and getting to scale its stats or the stats of any of your other creatures. And I think you're doing the usual cost-reducing spells gimmick with Mallard more than you are with Restless Summoners initially, at least if you're playing a fair game. However, if you don't want to play a fair game, Summoners is potentially the more explosive card of the pair, allowing you to more easily chain spells together. I can't help but think about the potential output if you get enough copies of Summoners into play. 6 Summoners means any 6-mana spell is effectively free, turning around and just starting big draw spell chains and running out a bunch of big threats, while netting mana for any that happen to reduce their cost. We've got clone effects like Piscus Duoja, Towering Aspen, cost-reducing draw options like Make a Break for It and Abrasive Punk, other explosive, potentially mana-positive 6-drops like Last Wish, Elope, Sylvia the Rewoven Oath, and Rowhammer. The opportunity to do some truly silly spell chains does start to fall into view. And hey, look, an X-cost spell that can be used to find a Restless Summoners and get an immediate copy of it. Grand Awakening is X red-green-green for a sorcery that tutors up a creature with mana value X or less into play, creating a token copy of it that isn't legendary, has haste, and sacrifices at the beginning of the next end step. It's a super high-impact search effect that provided you have a key value creature to get, or have a creature that excels in multiples, like the aforementioned Summoners. Though that use case probably demands you have a masked haste granter, so the non-token one that you get can be used immediately. We saw how high impact being able to get 2 copies of a creature could be with Extraction Mission, which underwent multiple changes only to wind up being banned for being a bit too potent each time. Mission is still more mana efficient than Grand Awakening in all of its various iterations, but the advantage to Awakening is that you don't have to jump through the hoops to get the desired card into your graveyard. Just spend a bit more mana. It's a shame that this is coming in to replace Cliques of Nylon, because you just know this would have gotten so silly with Gubernatorial Fundraiser. Writhing Shepherd is a 4-mana 4/4 Eldrazi with Trample, and though it doesn't say it now, it's meant to have Devoid as well. While it's in play, it makes your creature spells with mana value 4 or greater uncounterable, and has a 7-mana activated ability to give each of your creatures +X/+X Trample and Haste until end of turn, where X is that creature's power. It's a simple, decent 4-drop to help out if you're struggling with counterspells, though the problem arises that this isn't uncounterable itself and can just be picked off with your big creature on the stack to re-enable opposing counterspells. So it's decent, but probably not good enough. Solar, Caloran's Defiance, is 4 red and a green for a legendary bear with legendary 6/5 bear. I didn't actually write down its stats in the script. Legendary 6/5 bear with Trample and a second main phase trigger to untap your creatures and get an extra combat if you spent 6 or more mana in the turn. This does not specify mana on spells, unlike most of the other effects that care. So this works whether you're spending 6 mana to cast Solar, crack 3 clues, or really anything else. This is a solid top-end creature in its own right, and though there is a bit of competition in the 6-mana slot for red-green right now, courtesy of 3 very potent GQ legendaries, Solar has its own advantages, and they only get more clear once GQ rotates come New Year's Day 2027. Whether you're slotting it into that Pipe Dream Restless Summoner's shell, or just playing it as a finisher in a red-green mid-range or ramp shell, it will absolutely put in work to close out games. In Strength Entwined kicks off our green-white cards, and it's a simple one. 2 mana for an enchantment that gives your creature tokens +1/+1. We have a few scattered anthems at or above 3 mana that are all solid in their own right, and we've even seen some anthems necessitate changes, most recently with Westvale Cult Inductions, Transform Side being made into a creature so it can be more easily removed. We rarely get anthem effects at 2 mana, though, at least not when they aren't tied to specific creature types, so this is a big pickup for token strategies. Just a single copy of In Strength Entwined puts your 1/1s out of range of Impromptu Exit, and a pair of them protects against any 2 toughness sweeper. This might be the heart of token aggro decks moving forward. Oathbound Stalwart is a nice accompaniment to that plan, as a 3-mana 2/3 human soldier with Vigilance that creates a 1/1 human when it enters, and can create another when you attack with it and 1 or more tokens by paying another green and a white mana. It's solid stats for the cost, great with anthems. Solid stats because it comes with a 1/1 on top of being a 3-mana 2/3. And because of the shared typing between it and its token, it might also wind up being relevant for Kindred synergies thanks to Innistrad Witching Hour. Humans came out of the gates looking like one of the strongest types of that set as far as constructed Kindred shells were concerned, and while the best performing lists leaned more on individual bodies going tall rather than tokens going wide, there is definite merit to the go wide plan, especially now that we have 2 different 2-mana enchantments that can anthem your human tokens. The West District Union is a legendary 3-mana 3/4 human citizen with a repeating attack trigger, drawing you a card if you control more creatures than each opponent, or creating a 1/1 human otherwise. It's good stats for the cost, for sure, and the attack trigger is definitely nice, but I can't help but worry that this is just a bit too sluggish. No protection, no keywords, no immediacy. It feels like a recipe for disappointment. It's undeniably a solid creature if you get it rolling, and maybe it fits into these green-white token shells or human shells, but I can't help but worry that it just stacks up very poorly next to similar cards like Enduring Vowholder and High Sergeant Liano, which either have a much higher output or at least get something going as soon as you play them. Population Boom is 5 mana for an enchantment that doubles up the number of tokens that are created under your control, and can be activated for 6 mana to set their base power and toughness for all of your creatures to be equal to the total number of creatures you control for the turn. This isn't our first time with a parallel lives effect around, since we got Cyclical Symmetry back in Blood Like Rivers, and that did see some play here and there. Albeit more for its counter-doubling effect at the time, to my recollection. However, Harvesttide Procession was putting in some serious work this past season to the point of necessitating 2 different nerfs to both nudge up its cost and make it legendary. And while Population Boom lacks its strongest defining feature in that Procession makes its own tokens, Boom does amplify token makers better when they make more than one of a token. And coming with a built-in super anthem if you find yourself with 6 mana to spare is pretty nice. It's probably not going to be super relevant to Constructed, but Brawl players are going to have a field day the next time we get a Brawl GP, and they just get to make so many silly tokens. Ephraim High Alderman brings us into white-black. He's a 2-mana 2/2 legendary human advisor with lifelink and an end-step trigger to unearth a creature with a finality counter and a lifelink counter on it, provided you gain 3 or more life in the turn. This doesn't work with end-step life gain effects since the trigger has an intervening if, and with Ephraim only having 2 power, you'll need to either give him a stat boost or otherwise find some secondary way to gain enough life to trigger him. I think he looks best when you're getting the trigger the turn you play him, meaning he's rarely more than a 2/2 for 2 on curve. Aristocrat decks are likely going to be most excited about this effect at first glance, since Smiling Sludge and the new Soul Survivor both give you life as part of their triggers, though the finality counter Ephraim generates is a bit of a stopping point for that plan, and the nature of Ephraim is such that a faster Aristocrat deck will likely not get many opportunities to maximize the value over F-Frame, since they only really want to get a couple triggers at most. They want to end the game in as few turns as possible, where F-Frame wants to see many turns. We have some life gain centric tools that could support him, like Sunsower, but those pull you into 3 colors pretty solidly, so I'm kind of just left with F-Frame at a bit of a dead end. There aren't any ways he could be pushed harder by any means to my knowledge, and he's definitely a good card on the surface, but he might just be too fair to play. Stila, however, is not even remotely fair as far as what she's looking to do. She's a 3-mana 2/3 human noble that creates a treasure when she enters, draws you a card, and you lose 1 life when she dies, and has a triggered ability whenever any of your other creatures with power 2 or less have their own abilities trigger, allowing you to counter those abilities and instead do one of the things that Stilla does. We're going to say it's Stilla and be told that I'm wrong later, I'm sure. You can create more treasures, draw more cards at the cost of more life in place of any triggered abilities you don't care for. She's most obviously useful for replacing any detrimental triggers you have, like the attack trigger on Fardo's Scalpel, the enter trigger on Silent Veteran. She can shut off Decayed if you dip into Eternal, since our Decayed cards are mostly rotating. I think collectively all rotating, actually. But can shut off the Decayed ability, to my understanding, can counter the delayed sacrifice or exile of things like Decoy. I think she's best used beyond that in shells where you have a bunch of menial triggers you just might not mind countering. Basic stuff like Soul Sisters effects or stuff that repeatedly spits out small tokens are easy ones to counter for the sake of getting repeated value. The same is true for triggered abilities with a cost attached, where you might not currently have the mana to pay for said cost, like the ability on Weave Dispatcher. Getting to supplement some errant 1 life gain triggers with card draw and mana generation each turn is pretty strong, and has me fairly optimistic about her overall potential output. Karsten the Spinner is another 3-mana 2/3 legend, this time a human advisor with Death Touch, lifelink, and a combat damage trigger to exile another target creature you control, and return it to play under its owner's control at the next end step with a +1/+1 counter on it. Obviously, repeat enter triggers and what have you, but this also acts as a way to clear detrimental counters and other drawbacks, be they finality counters, splinter counters, and the ability removal from a raptured creature, and so on. He's probably a bit too slow for constructed, but he seems like a capable value engine if left unchecked, and is pretty annoying to deal with in combat. Discerning Patron is a 5-mana 2/4 human noble that allows you to pay X life when it enters, where X is its power, surveilling X and drawing X cards if you do so. You can also fragment it for a white and a black mana as a sorcery. It's a decent, albeit expensive and painful value creature. Not sure it'll see much play, but it's a thing you can grab with Contest Coordinator at least. We have made it to Blue-Red, where our final 2 Mythos Eldrazi reside, and as a result, also holds our last 2 colorless cards of the set. The first of them is Kozilek's Hexer, a 1 and a colorless 2/1 Eldrazi Warlock with prowess and an ability allowing you to spend colorless mana as though it were mana of any color to cast instant and sorcery spells. Its Mythos sorcery is Null Storm, blue-red-red, to exile target instant or sorcery card with mana value 4 or less from your graveyard, then casting a copy without paying its mana cost. There are some cute interactions to get out of the way before we talk combo potential. It's a Warlock, so you can get it with Matriarch of Veiledkin. You can spend colorless mana on instant sorceries to more reliably draw off of Ulman Triune Liaison. Just generally a bit of mana fixing for any colorless deck, making it easier to access removal and counter spells where your mana might otherwise fail to support them. But let's talk about the combos. With Hexer in play, if you can get Kozilek the Bonds Unmade in play, it makes 5 mana when you cast it, at which point you can spend that colorless mana, thanks to Hexer, on a Jump the Gap, or a Soul Cage, thus repeating Kozilek's cast trigger and netting a bunch of mana and cards in the process. You can then spend some of that colorless mana on Hexer's Nullstorm Mythos to reuse either Jump the Gap or Soul Cage, netting even more cards and even more mana. From there, you just keep spinning until you find an X-cost spell like Earthly Absolution or Olivia's Debauchery and turn all of your excess colorless mana into a swift and brutal kill, since you can still spend that colorless mana to pay the colored mana costs of Earthly Absolution or Olivia's Debauchery. With extra copies of Hexer just being extra Null Storms from hand, you have 12 total repeat cast effects for a total of 60 cards drawn, 24 excess colorless mana if you use all 12 of them. With Earthly Absolution dealing 3 damage to the opponent for each mana value they miss on, you need X to be 7+1 for each mana value. You need X to be 7 if they're at 20 life, 7+1 for each mana value you think they can afford to sacrifice or discard for, meaning you're likely to kill the opponent at roughly 15 mana every time. Easily achieved between Jump the Gap and a couple Null Storms. If anything, this combo might demand that you either play ways to reshuffle your graveyard quickly or just play more than 60 cards in the main. It's supremely all in, but it's very absolute in its ability to shut out the game once it's online, and it looks to be quite potent. We're going to break the mana value rule here real quick to cover the last Mythos Eldrazi. Billowing Weftbreaker is 4 generic for a 3/3 Eldrazi that creates an Eldrazi Scion whenever you cast a non-creature spell, with a 2-mana Mythos instant named Reprise. Reprise. Yeah, I don't know why I said it differently the first time. Reprise, which copies target instant or sorcery spell you control for a blue and a red. This pairs excellently with Kozilek's Hexer to not only push harder, but also open the door for any cantrips to be mana neutral. It's the combo piece I mentioned earlier with Ullman, allowing you to sacrifice an Eldrazi Scion to cast a 1-mana artifact and then immediately draw a card, replacing it in hand, so on and so forth. It also just does a nice impression of other similar non-creature spells lead to token maker stuff like Aether Dancer or the new Frida Weave Dancer, but with tokens that have far more impact beyond just contributing to your board presence. The Mythos looks like a bonus at first, since it's not only a built-in way to get another Scion token, but a way to amplify the impact of one of your instants and sorceries, but we'll get into another thing it can do in a moment. Stellar 4-drop engine piece just on its baseline, though. Enraptured Tailspinner is a 3-mana 2/2 human scholar with Flash, and an enter trigger to look at the top 6 cards of your library, allowing you to reveal an instant, sorcery, or Mythos card from among them and put it into your hand before shipping the rest to the bottom. Going 6 cards deep is a very nice deal here, as is the Flash, enabling this to chain you right into needed interaction later into the game. Getting Mythos creatures is also just very nice, since it allows you to more easily find key cards like Kozilek's Hexer or Xyla's Arbiter in decks that are built around them. It's a very good card selection tool, and one I suspect will see some real use over time. Lost to Endless Scripture is a kind of clunky 3-mana mythic enchantment. It returns a card with Mythos to your hand on enter and fragments a creature whenever you cast a copy of its Mythos. Important to note here is that you're only casting a copy of a Mythos when it's on the battlefield, since the Mythos from hand is just the spell proper. So the natural pattern it sets up is for you to cast a Mythos from hand, use Lost to Endless Scripture to rebuy the Mythos creature, and then play the creature out, at which point you can reuse its Mythos and get a 1/1 copy whose Mythos is still available. It's an interesting bit of potential, but it is just a bit too clunky. But it does does bring to mind, rather, the notion of copying Billowing Weftbreaker, which is when I realized that there is another combo you can do with Billowing Weftbreaker. If you cast an instant or sorcery that is creating a token copy of Billowing Weftbreaker, and you have Kozilek's Hexer in play, that will create a 1/1 Eldrazi Scion creature token on the casting of that spell. You can then cast Reprise off the Weftbreaker to copy that clone effect, making another Eldrazi Scion, and then resolve the copy of the clone effect, but don't resolve the original clone effect. You'll make a new Billowing Weftbreaker, you spend 2 mana using the Eldrazi Scion and 1 other mana to cast the token copy Weftbreaker's Reprise, triggering both Weftbreakers to make Eldrazi Scions. copy the clone spell, you make a third Weft Raker, that one's reprise nets you an Eldrazi Scion, and then you just keep going until you have endless, infinite Billowing Weft Rakers and infinite Eldrazi Scions with one Weft Raker that can still use reprise, and probably a Kozilek's Hexer, which you can then copy and then get Nullstorm to just cast any instant sorcery from your graveyard that might find you a way to kill your opponent immediately with an infinite amount of Eldrazi Scions. So yeah, this is a kill. These two Eldrazi are absolutely ridiculous. And I realized how ridiculous they are together without really much effort beyond them by looking at Lost to Endless Scripture and wishing I could get more than one copy of Billowing Weft Raker. Ravaged Eviscerator is our first black-green card, a 2-mana 2/1 Eldrazi with Devoid that makes a Scion on enter and gets a +1/+1 counter if a Scion dies while the Eviscerator has no counters on it. It's a spectacular mid-range card. It's effectively a 2-mana 3/2 that jumps up mana to play a 4-drop on turn 3. We've had creatures play this role before, including other Eldrazi as far back as GQC with the Propagate mechanic, but this might be the highest stat line we've seen on one of these kinds of creatures in a while. It's especially sweet given black and green are getting some Haymaker 4-drops in this new set between Gloomveil Trackers and Soulflame Immolator. So a turn 2 Eviscerator could be a turn 3 Soulflame Immolator, which then you get to pay 2 life, make another Eviscerator, which makes another Scion. You pay 0 life, make another one of the Scions, and your turn 4 play was making a 4/4 flyer, paying 2 life, and getting another 1/1 that made 2 more Eldrazi Scions for no additional life on top of it. Oh, and also you can pay 4 life to make another copy of the Immolator as well. And that's just with the Immolator. You can just play out the Eviscerator and put in a Gloomveil Trackers into play on turn 3, where if your turn 1 play was Wreckage Inquisitors, you get to swing in with a 3/2 Eviscerator and a 3/3 Clue on turn 3. And again, like, it's a 3/2 in a lot of these scenarios, so it's threatening the opponent's life total on top of jumping you up a mana for turn 3. It's just a superb mid-range card. I think it'll be a mainstay of black-green decks moving forward. Sludge Trawlers is a sacrifice card less in the vein of traditional aristocrats and more in line with the gradual sacrifice plans we've seen pushed in Valir. It's 3-mana 3/2 construct artifact creature with trample and a scaling trigger whenever you sacrifice a creature, drawing you a card at the cost of 1 life the first time it resolves each turn, and putting a +1/+1 counter on up to 2 different target creatures the second time it resolves each turn. These triggers are very free off the back of Eldrazi Scions, but they're also manageable with engines like Darkstar Harbinger, Forsaken Shroudguard, and it brings to mind something similar to Eyes of the Overseer, wanting you to have, 1 or 2 death triggers per turn rather than blitz-style payoffs like Smiling Sludge. As a result, it might run the same risk as some of these other pieces of just being too sluggish and too fair, but the card draw and stat scaling here are definitely something worth at least giving credit to. We have a new card with no limit to how many copies we can include in the deck, which means it's time to get reckless. Something in the Soil is 1 black and a green for a sorcery that gives you a soil counter, then mills you for X cards and reanimates any permanent in your graveyard with mana value X or less, where X is twice the number of soil counters you have. By the very nature of the card, you're likely to want a lot of copies and a lot of other permanent cards alongside it, meaning the 60 card minimum is liable to look like a bad suggestion rather than the optimal build. The first cast is very difficult to miss with, courtesy of lands being eligible targets, and the ramp makes it easier to cast multiple copies of this per turn. It only takes 4 copies to start cheating in things like Tesh Fragmented Founder or Resource Inversion, and most of the big Eldrazi Titans and the Spirit Dragons from Solitaire only require a couple more copies from there. It's a very splashy build around, and one that I suspect will draw a lot of excitement as folks try to crack the perfect Something in the Soil list. Though the most beautiful part of it all is that the deck lends itself to experimental inclusions pretty well. Skittering Swarm Lord is a 5-mana 5/5 Eldrazi spider with Devoid, Reach, and a triggered ability that fires off when you cast it and at the beginning of your upkeep, allowing you to make allowing you to exile a creature card from your graveyard to make an Eldrazi Scion. Making Eldrazi Scions on turn 5 is maybe a bit too late for it to start meaningfully making mana, but this is a nice gradual board builder. The 5 mana slot's been kind of nebulous in black midrange decks for a while now, with the most popular consideration being Femeros Redeemer and League of Their Own really struggling to trail behind. Swarmlord does play favorably with Redeemer because it exiles your own graveyard, but that's also true of League of Their Own, and it's not really changing its inclusion alongside Redeemer. I mentioned much earlier that red-white is all about artifact aggro, so let's talk about the set's marquee pieces in red and white. Inspiring Orrery is the 2-drop on offer, dealing damage equal to the number of other artifacts and creatures you control to a creature an opponent controls on enter, and it becomes a 2/2 hasty artifact creature whenever you cast another artifact spell. Having removal that's also a synergy piece and a threat is kind of stellar, since it passively contributes to your total artifact count for things like Sculptor's Replica tokens or Jetfoot Greaves, while also dodging sorcery speed Wraths, and it's even able to crew the Greaves when it's animated if you don't have anything else to do so. It's an easy 4-of in my eyes. This is a core part of making this deck work reliably to me. Darkwood Gorillas is a 3-mana 3/3 construct soldier with first strike and an enter trigger to look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of artifacts you control. You exile up to 2 of them and put the rest on the bottom in any order, and then can play one of the exiled cards each turn you attack with the Gorillas. This is some nice refuel potential, especially since the deck is naturally inclined to want to go as wide as it possibly can with artifacts. The biggest concern I have is that you get no value the turn you play it, meaning the more important the cards it exiles are, and it exiles them face up, the more likely it is that it just becomes a magnet for opposing removal. That does mean it insulates the rest of your board from targeted removal, but it's a bit of a bummer to lose your 3-drop and effectively have to discard 2 spells because this thing never got to go to combat. Artillery Commander, I have a bit more hope for. It's also a 3/3 for 3, this time dealing 1 damage to each opponent and gaining you 1 life whenever another non-token artifact you control enters, and impulse drawing the top card of your library for the turn whenever 2 or more of your artifact creatures attack. This one might seem hostile to artifact tokens at first since they don't proc the ping effect, but 2 1/1 construct tokens still impulse draws the top card of your deck, so it doesn't mind too much. It can be awkward to get use of the impulse draw the turn you play it out, especially if you're playing this on curve, but it could still let you draw through and play an unmarked headstones, and it's very easy to run it out on turn 4 before making your land drop to see if you get a land or a 1-mana spell. It's a far more stable engine than the Gorillas, and with both more immediacy and more long-term output, I'm a big fan. Our last red-white card is Elisa, Hand of Torvinald, a 4-mana 4/4 legendary human soldier whose enter trigger allows you to freely activate her ability. That ability normally costs 4 mana while also requiring you to tap 2 untapped artifacts and or creatures you control to put 2 +1/+1 counters and a flying counter on an artifact you control, optionally animating the target to permanently become a 0/0 artifact creature. This is the biggest reason to look at something like Unmarked Headstones in these shells, in my opinion, where it is a super free artifact to get into play for both total artifact count, as well as being an easy target for Elisa and an easy means of paying the tapped artifact part of her ability after she's entered. The flying counter is also a huge deal because it jumps your board over the opposing blockers, helping your Jetfoot Greaves or other grounded artifact get over the opponent's board to push more damage more reliably. This probably could never be a 4-of considering the casting cost and legendary typing, but this is definitely worth including at least a couple copies of. The only big question I have is I don't know how this works with the legend rule. I don't know if you can still activate its ability if you sacrifice the one you just played to the legend rule. But that's probably not the most important thing about this card. One final color pair remains. Let's talk about green-blue clues. Starting with Concerning Discoveries, a 2-mana enchantment that lets you freely crack a clue when it enters or make a clue if you don't, and which has a 1 per turn trigger to tap or untap target permanent when you sacrifice a clue. This can untap your lands, tap your opponent's lands, tap down blockers, tap down attackers, untap one of your own creatures. These are just the tame applications. You can use this to build up charge counters on Atomic Core faster, net extra mana off of a Cosmic Lotus, helping your big mana deck go even bigger over time. It helps that ramp strategies, like ones looking to cap out with either Cosmic Lotus or mana doublers for your lands, are naturally better at sacrificing clues because they'll have more mana to do so. and thus will have more opportunities to try and leverage this enchantment's trigger. It's not going to be too explosive overall, but when this effectively just says the first clue you sacrifice each turn is ice, tap target permanent, draw a card, that's pretty good for really messing with your opponent's curve and their ability to apply pressure. Lantha Task Force Sergeant could be a creature worth untapping with that enchantment. He's a 3-mana legendary 2/4 human detective with a static ability to reduce the cost of artifact abilities by 1, with the expected rider as to not make them free, as well as a 2-end tap activation to have him investigate. Naturally, this reduces the mana required to crack clue tokens, but also gives us the opportunity to reduce things like the Planar Archives draw activations and extra turn activation, make Stonework Titan cost 1 mana to bounce your things. The most exciting interaction for me is probably Heartfire Lantern, actually, since Lantha reducing that to 1 mana lets you get a way to effectively mana wash any color you please. It's another way to solve any colored mana issues posed by infinite Eldrazi Scion loops, but also just is useful for meeting stringent mana costs. That interaction probably doesn't make it to competitive play, but I have a soft spot in my heart for it. Leonard, Experiment 0, is a legendary 4/4 Ooze Horror for 4 mana that creates an Eldrazi Scion on enter, and has a coalition trigger that lets you make all of your attacking tokens temporarily become copies of any target non-legendary creature, attacking or otherwise. I'm not sure what to do with this one. He wants you to go wide, but also have a big enough creature worth copying over, presenting this weird deck-building puzzle that pulls you in 2 separate directions simultaneously. The only immediate ideas that come to mind are big tokens, or creatures that bridge the gap nicely by having tokens become copies of things with combat damage triggers or other reasons to care about tokens. Of cards that make tokens, the 2 that I found that seemed the most interesting are Commander of the Vow, which is a reasonable include in a tokens deck like this anyways, and which means that all of your tokens scale by the number of tokens that connected against your opponent. And Simian Pupil, which might be more of a stretch, but if you, say, swing in with Leonard and 5 creature tokens and make those tokens copies of Simian Pupil, your Simian Pupil that isn't attacking, plus the 5 that are, draw you... doing the math in my head... Draw you 30 cards. So that's a thing. Last but not least, we end with Stelver, the Eyes and Ears. They're a 5-mana 4/4 legendary human detective with flash, and an enter trigger that has them bounce up to 1 target creature each player controls before investigating, and they have a triggered ability to give your creature spells flash for the turn whenever you sacrifice a clue. The sole function I can find worth in here is as a late-game removal engine for control or flash decks, because Stelver can bounce itself to effectively become a 5-mana unsummon that buys itself back. Probably too much mana to be truly worthwhile, but it could be profoundly annoying if it ends up being reasonably accessible to big mana strategies. I have to be honest, that does not feel like something that was intentional, though. As far as fair applications go, I mean, you can use this to pick up something that's being targeted by removal or is otherwise dying in combat while also screwing with your opponent's board still. And being able to give your creature spells flash as long as you've sacrificed a clue in the turn is pretty nice. And that, at long last, concludes our comprehensive review of Stirrings in Goldport. As always, check out all of the links in the description if you want to do your own dive through the format and what we're gaining. In the meantime, take care of yourself. I'm going to go make sure my desk is okay and give my voice a rest, and I'll see you all in the Revolution chat. Bye-bye.